The 13-year-old girl's whisper cut through the darkness like a knife. I'm too young to be a wife. Those 7 words would force a widowed rancher to choose between the law and his conscience, between safety and salvation. In 3 days, powerful men would come to claim her as property. In 3 days, Ethan Cole would have to decide if one child's life was worth losing everything he'd built. This is the story of the girl who refused to be silenced, and the man who chose to listen when no one else would. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The sun was dying over the Montana Territory, bleeding crimson across the horizon like a wound that wouldn't close. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his ranch house, one weathered hand resting on the post that had held up this roof for 15 years. Through his wedding, through his wife's death, through seasons of plenty and drought alike. The wood was smooth under his palm, worn down by the same hand that now gripped it, seeking something solid in a world that had proven anything but. He was 43 years old, though the frontier had a way of adding years to a man that didn't show in numbers. His face was carved with lines earned honest, squinting into too many sunrises, weathering too many storms, burying too many hopes in soil that sometimes gave back and sometimes just took. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and his beard, which he kept trimmed short, showed more gray than he cared to admit. But his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, those hadn't dimmed. They just learned to see harder truths. The ranch stretched out before him in the fading light, 200 acres of grazing land, a barn that stood straight and true, fences he'd mended so many times he knew every post by memory, and a small herd of cattle that represented everything he'd worked for since coming west as a young man, with nothing but ambition and a borrowed horse. It wasn't empire, but it was his. Built with his own hands, maintained by his own sweat, defended by his own stubborn refusal to let the land break him the way it broke so many others. Sarah had loved this view. She'd stand right here, same spot, her hand in his, and talk about the children they'd fill this house with, the life they'd build together. That was before the fever took her, before the silence moved in and made itself at home in every corner of the house they'd shared. 3 years gone, and sometimes he still turned to say something to her before remembering the empty space beside him. The land had given him purpose when grief tried to take it away. There was always something that needed doing: a fence to mend, a roof to patch, cattle to tend, hay to cut. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the darkness. Most days, it was enough. The evening was settling in peaceful, the kind of quiet that made a man think he might sleep without dreams tonight. Then he saw it, a dark shape moving along the ridge road, materializing out of the dust and distance like something conjured from the failing light itself. A wagon, single horse, moving faster than was wise on a road that could turn treacherous in the dusk. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the desperation in how the driver pushed the animal, the way the wagon lurched and swayed over ruts that should have been taken slow. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle that leaned against the porch rail. Not raising it, not yet, but knowing where it was. Out here, you learn to measure trouble by how fast it came at you, and this was coming fast. The wagon turned off the main road onto his property without hesitation, as if the driver knew exactly where she was headed. And it was a she. He could see that now as the wagon drew closer. A woman, thin and bent forward, dressed in dark clothes that had seen better days. Not young, but not old enough to be driving this hard unless something was chasing her that couldn't be seen. Ethan stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the packed earth with soft thuds. He didn't pick up the rifle, but he didn't move away from it either. His hand stayed loose at his side, ready. The wagon rolled into his yard and stopped 20 feet from where he stood. The horse was lathered, breathing hard, its head hanging low. Whoever this woman was, she'd pushed the animal to its limits and maybe beyond. That alone told him something was badly wrong. The woman sat frozen on the bench, her hands still gripping the reins so tight her knuckles showed white even in the dimming light. She was maybe 50, with a face that had known hard work and harder choices. Her eyes, when they finally met his, carried a plea that words hadn't yet formed. "Ma'am," Ethan said, his voice level and calm. "You're on private property." She flinched at his words but didn't look away. I know whose land this is, Mr. Cole. I came here because I heard you were a decent man. I'm praying to God that's true. Decent enough not to turn away someone in need, he replied. What kind of trouble are you running from? Not running from, she said, her voice cracking. Running to. I didn't know where else. She stopped, swallowed hard, and tried again. My name is Ruth Brennan. I've come from Silver Creek, 3 days hard riding, and I've brought someone who needs help more than anyone I've ever known. It was only then that Ethan noticed the shape in the back of the wagon. Small, hunched beneath a blanket, so still he'd mistaken it for cargo. As he watched, the blanket moved, not wind, but breath. Who's with you? He asked, his voice quieter now. Ruth Brennan's face crumpled, and for a moment Ethan thought she might cry, but she pulled herself together with visible effort, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. My niece. Her name is Mara. She's 13 years old, and 3 days from now she's supposed to become a wife. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Ethan thought he understood about the evening. Supposed to? Sold, Ruth said, and now the tears did come, tracking down her weathered cheeks. Her father sold her to pay a debt, $500 to a man named Marcus Brennan, no relation, though he shares our name like it's some kind of sick joke. He's 52 years old, owns half of Silver Creek, and he's mean as a snake when he doesn't get what he wants. The marriage is set for Saturday. There's a contract signed and witnessed. Legal, they say. Binding. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such things. Child brides sold or traded like livestock, all dressed up in the language of marriage and family honor to hide what it really was. But hearing about it and having it arrive in a wagon on his property were two different things entirely. Where's her father now? Dead drunk in Silver Creek, I imagine. Or counting his money, maybe both. Ruth's voice had gone hard. He's my brother, God help me, but I can't defend this. I won't. When I heard what he'd done, when I saw Mara's face, I took her. In the night, left a note saying we'd gone to visit family in the next county. Bought us maybe 3 days before Marcus figures out what happened and comes looking. And you brought her here because I heard you were the kind of man who'd stand up when it mattered. Because your wife, God rest her soul, she helped my cousin once when no one else would. Because I'm desperate, Mr. Cole, and desperation makes you believe in the goodness of strangers when you've got no other choice left. Ethan looked at the shape in the wagon, still motionless beneath the blanket. The girl, she's willing to run? She's terrified, Ruth said, but she told me something when I came to take her. She said, I'm too young to be a wife, Aunt Ruth. Just like that. 13 years old, and she knew exactly what was being done to her, knew it was wrong, and had the courage to say it out loud. The sun had dropped below the horizon now, leaving only the purple-gray light of dusk. In the shadows, Ethan couldn't make out the details of the girl's face, but he could see her eyes, wide and dark, and watching him with the kind of intensity that comes from having your entire life balanced on the decision of a stranger. Every practical bone in his body told him to say no, to give them food and water, point them toward the next county, maybe even loan them money for a fresh start somewhere far from here. Getting involved in this would bring trouble to his door, the kind of trouble that didn't knock politely. Marcus Brennan sounded like a man with money and power, the kind who'd use both to get what he claimed was his by right and contract. Standing against that would mean risking everything Ethan had built. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd said when they were still young and full of certainty about how the world should work. If you can help and you don't, you're just as guilty as the ones doing harm. He thought it was naive when she said it, young person's idealism that would get ground down by reality soon enough. But Sarah had never let reality grind her down, not even at the end. She'd held on to that belief like a rope in a flood, and it had made her the best person he'd ever known. Get down from the wagon, Ethan said finally. Both of you, let's talk inside. Ruth Brennan's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it seemed to take years off her face. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Don't thank me yet, he interrupted. I haven't agreed to anything except a conversation. Now come on before the dark settles in complete. He watched as Ruth climbed down from the wagon, her movement stiff from long hours of driving. Then she reached up to help the figure in the back, murmuring soft words that Ethan couldn't quite hear. The girl who emerged from beneath the blanket was small, even for 13. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't so hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. She wore a simple dress that had been mended multiple times, and her feet were covered in boots at least 2 sizes too large. But it was her eyes that struck Ethan, old eyes in a young face, the kind that came from seeing things no child should see. She looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror, and Ethan felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't a story he'd heard in town or a problem that belonged to someone else. This was a child standing in his yard, silent and shaking, asking without words if he was the kind of man who'd help or the kind who'd look away. "Come on," he said, gentler this time. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The girl took one step forward, then stopped. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, Ethan had to lean in to hear it. "Are you going to make me go back?" 7 words. That's all it took to settle the question completely. "No," Ethan said. "I'm not going to make you go back." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away fiercely, as if crying would somehow make her less credible, less worthy of help. She nodded once, sharp and decisive, then followed her aunt toward the house. Ethan stood in the yard for a moment longer, looking out at the darkening land. Somewhere out there, 3 days' ride away, a powerful man was expecting to take possession of his purchased bride. Somewhere closer, people were probably already starting to ask questions about Ruth Brennan's sudden departure with her niece. The clock was ticking, and when it ran out, trouble would come calling. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd planned and the life he'd ended up with instead. He thought about the quiet years since her death, the safe years, where the biggest risks he took were financial, and the only person who could get hurt was himself. Then he thought about a 13-year-old girl whispering, "I'm too young to be a wife," and he knew that safety had just become a luxury he could no longer afford. He turned and followed them into the house. Inside, the main room was simple but well kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the mantel above it holding a few books and a tin cup Sarah had loved for reasons Ethan never quite understood. A solid table with 4 chairs sat in the center, and doors led off to a bedroom and a small kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was clean and warm and honest, built by hands that didn't believe in pretense. Ruth had guided Mara to one of the chairs, and the girl sat perched on its edge like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. Her hands were folded in her lap, gripping each other so tightly the fingers had gone white. Ethan moved to the fireplace and stirred the embers back to life, adding wood until flames caught and spread. The light pushed back the shadows and brought warmth to the room, but it didn't touch the cold fear in Mara's eyes. "You hungry?" he asked, directing the question to both of them, but looking at the girl. Mara shook her head quickly, but Ruth answered for her. "We haven't eaten since morning. Didn't want to stop, but I don't want to impose more than we already—" "It's not imposing if I'm offering," Ethan said. He moved to the kitchen and returned with bread, cheese, and dried meat. Simple food, but filling. He set it on the table between them. "Eat. Then we'll talk about what comes next." Ruth reached for the food immediately, but Mara just stared at it as if she'd forgotten what eating was for. Her aunt cut a piece of bread, added cheese, and pressed it into the girl's hands with a gentle firmness that spoke of long practice in caring for stubborn children. "Eat, sweetheart," Ruth murmured. "You need your strength." Mara took a small bite, mechanical and joyless. But she took another, and slowly something in her posture relaxed. Just a fraction, but enough that Ethan could see the child beneath the terror. He sat down across from them, giving them space but staying close enough to talk. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the quiet noises of eating. Ethan had learned long ago that silence could be kinder than words, that sometimes people needed to gather themselves before they could speak the truths that mattered. It was Mara who broke the silence. "My father said I should be grateful." Her voice was stronger now, though still quiet. "He said Marcus Brennan was a respectable man, that I'd have a good home, fine dresses, everything a girl could want. He said I was lucky." She looked up at Ethan, and her eyes were blazing with an anger that sat strange on such a young face. I'm 13 years old. I still play with my rag doll sometimes when I think no one's watching. I don't know how to run a house or please a husband or any of the things they say I'll need to know, and I'm supposed to feel lucky that a man old enough to be my grandfather wants to—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I'm too young. I told my father that. I begged him, but he wouldn't listen. The money was all he cared about." Ruth reached over and took her niece's hand, holding it tight. "Your father made a terrible choice, Mara, but it doesn't have to be your burden to carry." "The law says it is, Mara said bitterly. "The law says he can sell me like cattle and call it marriage, and there's nothing I can do about it." Ethan had been listening carefully, his expression neutral, but now he leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about Marcus Brennan. Not what your father said about him. What you know." Mara's hand trembled in her aunt's grip. "He owns the Silver Creek Mining Company. Half the town works for him, and the other half owes him money. When he wants something, he gets it. People who stand against him—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There was a man who tried to organize the miners for better wages. They found him beaten near to death in an alley. No one was ever arrested." "And the sheriff?" "On Brennan's payroll," Ruth interjected, "along with the judge, the mayor, and anyone else with any authority. Silver Creek is his town, Mr. Cole. He built it, and he runs it like a kingdom." Ethan sat back, processing this. He'd known men like Brennan, men who mistook wealth for righteousness and power for permission. They were the kind who'd wrap their cruelty in legal language and call it legitimate business. Fighting them meant fighting the entire system they'd built around themselves. "Why you?" he asked Mara directly. "Why did Brennan want you specifically?" The girl's face colored with shame, and she looked down at the table. It was Ruth who answered. "Because she's young, because she's beautiful in a way that will only grow more so, and because—" Ruth's voice hardened. "Because Marcus Brennan's last 3 wives all died within 5 years of marrying him. Accidents, he called them. Falls, illnesses, a mysterious fire, each one younger than the last. Mara would be number 4. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ethan's hands, resting on the table, curled into fists. "The authorities know about this?" "Know about it? They helped write the marriage contract." Ruth's laugh was bitter as ash. "Brennan spreads enough money around that people see what he wants them to see. And what he wants them to see is a respectable businessman offering security to a girl from a poor family. Never mind that she's barely more than a child. Never mind that his previous wives all met convenient ends. The law is on his side, and that makes it all proper and legal." Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man who'd been content to mind his own business, tend his land, and let the world's ugliness stay beyond his borders. That man seemed very far away now. "If I help you," he said slowly, not turning around, "Brennan will come for me. He'll bring the law, the contract, and probably armed men to back it up. He'll destroy everything I've built here if he can. You understand that?" "Yes," Ruth said quietly, "and you still came anyway." "Because I didn't know where else to go. Because I've heard you're a good man, and I'm betting everything on that being true." Ethan turned back to face them. "Good men die out here same as bad ones. Probably easier, because they hesitate when hard men don't." "I know," Ruth said, "but they die standing up. That counts for something." Mara had been quiet during this exchange, her eyes moving between the 2 adults like she was watching a trial that would determine her fate. Now she spoke, her voice small but steady. "I can go back if I have to. If it means you'll be safe, Mr. Cole. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me." It was the bravery in her voice that broke something in Ethan. This child, terrified and alone, offering to sacrifice herself to protect a stranger. That kind of courage deserved to be answered with courage, not calculation. "You're not going back," he said firmly. "Not to Brennan, not to your father, not to anyone who'd treat you like property. That's decided." "But that's decided," he repeated, and this time his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Now we need to figure out how to make it stick." Ruth's relief was palpable, but she kept her composure. "What do you suggest?" Ethan returned to the table and sat down. "First thing, You can't stay here. Brennan will come looking, and this ranch is too exposed to defend if he brings enough men. But I've got a place he won't think to look. A cellar beneath the barn, built it years back for storing supplies during hard winters. It's hidden, secure, and most importantly, it's not on any property maps or records. Mara can stay there while we figure out the next move. A cellar? Mara's voice was uncertain. Like, underground? It's better than it sounds, Ethan assured her. Dry, warm enough with blankets, and there's a ventilation shaft that brings in fresh air. I'll bring you food and water, and you'll be safe. That's what matters most right now. For how long? As long as it takes to find a permanent solution. Might be days, might be longer. Can you handle that? Mara looked at her aunt, then back to Ethan. She nodded slowly. I can handle it. I've handled worse. Something in the way she said it made Ethan wonder what worse meant in her short life. But that was a question for another time. What about me? Ruth asked. If I disappear, it'll confirm their suspicions that I took her. You can't disappear completely, Ethan agreed. But you can't stay here either. Tomorrow you'll head to Lewiston. It's 2 days' ride north. Tell anyone who asks that you were visiting family, that Mara stayed behind in Silver Creek, and you don't know anything about her running away. Make yourself visible. Establish that you were nowhere near here when she vanished. You want me to lie? I want you to survive, Ethan said bluntly. If Brennan thinks you helped her escape, he'll make you tell him where she is. Better he thinks you're as confused as everyone else. Ruth's face showed her internal struggle, but she eventually nodded. All right, but Mara will be safer here than anywhere else you could take her. I give you my word on that. The three of them sat in the firelight, bound together by a choice that would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet predict. Outside, the Montana night had settled in complete, vast and dark, and full of distance. Somewhere in that darkness, Marcus Brennan was probably sleeping soundly, secure in his belief that in 3 days he'd have what he'd purchased. He was in for a surprise. Ethan stood and gestured toward the door. Come on, I'll show you the cellar now, while there's no chance of being seen. Better you know where you're going before the need becomes urgent. They followed him out into the night. The air had turned cold, sharp enough to bite through clothing and raise goosebumps on exposed skin. The barn loomed ahead, a darker shadow against the star-scattered sky. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and horses and leather, honest smells that spoke of work and routine. Ethan lit a lantern, and warm light pushed back the shadows, revealing stalls and tools and the organized chaos of a working ranch. He led them to the far corner, where hay bales were stacked against the wall. With practiced efficiency, he moved the bales aside, revealing a trapdoor cut into the floor. The hinges were well-oiled and opened silently, showing stairs descending into darkness. Watch your step, Ethan said, holding the lantern high. Stairs are solid, but they're steep. He descended first, and the others followed carefully. The cellar was larger than Mara had expected, maybe 12 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that Ethan could stand upright. Shelves lined one wall, still holding preserved food from previous years. A cot sat in one corner, covered with clean blankets. A small table and chair occupied the center, and in the far corner, a pipe extended up through the ceiling, the ventilation shaft Ethan had mentioned. It's not a palace, Ethan said, setting the lantern on the table. But it's dry and hidden. The trap door, when covered with hay, is invisible unless you know exactly where to look, and the ventilation shaft exits up in the barn rafters, hidden by the roof structure. You could have a dozen men searching this barn, and they'd never find you down here. Mara walked slowly around the space, her hand trailing along the rough wooden walls. How long did your wife have to hide here? She asked suddenly. Ethan blinked, surprised. What makes you think Sarah ever— You built this too well for just storage, Mara interrupted quietly. The ventilation, the cot, the way the trap door is disguised. This was built to hide someone. And you said she helped my aunt's cousin once. I just figured— She was perceptive, this girl. Sharper than her circumstances might suggest. You're right, Ethan admitted. During the war years, this ranch was a stop on a different kind of journey. Sarah helped people who needed to disappear for a while. This cellar kept them safe until they could move on. Slaves? Ruth asked softly. People, Ethan corrected. Just people looking for freedom. Sarah believed everyone deserved a chance at that, regardless of what the law said at the time. Mara ran her hand over the cot, her expression thoughtful. She sounds like she was brave. She was the bravest person I ever knew, Ethan said. And if she were here now, she'd be helping you without a moment's hesitation. So that's what I'm going to do. The girl looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving, something like hope flickered in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I know you don't have to do this. I know it's dangerous. But thank you. Call me Ethan, he said. We're past formalities now. And you don't need to thank me for doing what's right. That's just basic human decency, even if it's become rare enough to seem special. They returned to the house, and Ethan prepared bedding for them in the main room. Ruth on the cot he dragged in from the storage room, Mara wrapped in blankets by the fire. He retreated to his own bedroom but didn't undress. He lay on top of the covers, fully clothed, watching shadows dance on the ceiling and thinking about the choice he'd made. In 3 days, Marcus Brennan would realize his bride was gone. In 3 days, questions would be asked and searches would begin. In 3 days, everything would change. But tonight, a 13-year-old girl was sleeping safe and warm instead of lying awake in terror about a wedding that should never happen. Tonight, that was enough. He closed his eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. When it finally did, he dreamed of Sarah standing on the porch, her hand raised in farewell, her voice carrying on the wind. If you can help and you don't, you're just as guilty as the ones doing harm. He woke before dawn, as he always did, to find Ruth already up and making coffee with the supplies she'd found in his kitchen. Mara still slept by the dying fire, curled into herself like she was trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. I'll leave within the hour, Ruth said quietly, handing him a cup. The sooner I'm gone, the better. Make it look like I was never here. Agreed. Take the main road north, stop in settlements along the way. Make sure people see you and remember you somewhere that isn't here. And Mara? I'll move her to the cellar after you go. Bring her food twice a day, more if she needs it. She won't be comfortable, but she'll be safe. Ruth nodded, then hesitated. Mr. Cole, Ethan, I need to ask you something. When Brennan comes, and he will come, what are you going to do? I'm going to protect that girl. Even if it means violence? Ethan looked at her steadily over the rim of his coffee cup. I didn't say I was looking for violence. I said I'd protect her. But if violence comes looking for me, I won't turn away from it either. That's what I was afraid you'd say, Ruth murmured. Be careful. Marcus Brennan doesn't fight fair. Neither do I when someone threatens what I'm protecting. They woke Mara as the sun began to paint the eastern sky with pale light. The girl was groggy and confused at first, then remembered where she was and why, and the fear returned to settle behind her eyes like a permanent resident. Ruth knelt beside her niece and pulled her into a fierce embrace. I have to go now, sweetheart, but you're going to be safe here. Ethan will take care of you, I promise. When will I see you again? Mara's voice was muffled against her aunt's shoulder. I don't know, but you will. This isn't forever, just until we can find a better way. Can you be brave a little longer? Mara pulled back and wiped her eyes. I'll try. That's my girl. Ethan walked Ruth out to her wagon. The horse had been fed and watered and looked considerably better than it had the night before. Ruth climbed up onto the bench and gathered the reins, then looked down at Ethan with an expression that mixed gratitude and guilt in equal measure. I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to your door, she said. You brought a child who needed help. That's not trouble, that's opportunity. Opportunity to do the right thing. Now go, before someone sees you here. She nodded and snapped the reins. The wagon rolled forward, picking up speed as it headed toward the main road. Ethan watched until it disappeared over the ridge, then turned back to the house where a 13-year-old girl waited to be hidden away like contraband. Inside, Mara had gathered her few belongings, a small bundle of clothes and the rag doll she'd mentioned, a faded thing that had clearly been loved hard and long. Ready? Ethan asked. She nodded, clutching the doll to her chest. Will I really be safe in the cellar? As safe as I can make you. No one knows it exists except me and now you. Even if they search the barn, and they will, they won't find you unless I tell them where to look. And I won't. Why? The question came out small and confused. Why are you doing this for someone you don't even know? Ethan considered the question carefully. Because my wife taught me that turning away from injustice makes you part of it. Because you're a child who deserves a childhood, not a forced marriage to a dangerous man. And because when you said you were too young to be a wife, you were absolutely right. Nobody should be able to argue with that truth. But since they did, someone needed to listen. Might as well be me. Mara's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. I'll try not to be trouble. You're not trouble. You're a person who deserves better than what you got. Now come on, let's get you settled before the day gets going and there's any chance of unwanted eyes. They walked to the barn together, Ethan carrying extra blankets and a basket of food. In the daylight, the barn looked ordinary, innocent, just another building on a working ranch. No one would suspect what it held. He opened the trap door and lit the lantern below, then helped Mara down the stairs. In the cellar, she looked even smaller, more vulnerable. He set down the supplies and showed her where everything was: food, water, extra blankets, the chamber pot hidden behind a curtain in the corner. I'll come twice a day, he said, morning and evening, when there's least chance of being observed. If you need anything urgent, there's a bell rope here. He indicated a cord hanging near the cot. That rings up in my house. But only use it if it's truly an emergency. Sound carries, and we can't risk anyone hearing. I understand. And Mara? If someone does find you, if somehow they get past me and discover the cellar, you tell them I forced you to hide here. You tell them you were too scared of me to resist. You make me the villain, understand? Don't protect me. But that would be a lie. It would be a lie that might save your life. Promise me. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I promise. Good girl. He turned to leave, then paused at the bottom of the stairs. One more thing. What you said last night about being too young to be a wife? Don't ever let anyone convince you that knowing your own worth is wrong. You spoke truth to power, and that takes more courage than most adults ever manage. Be proud of that. Then he climbed the stairs, closed the trap door, and carefully rearranged the hay bales until no trace of the entrance remained. He stood in the quiet barn listening. Nothing. No sound from below, no indication that anything was different than it had been yesterday. Perfect. The day progressed with deliberate normalcy. Ethan tended his cattle, mended a section of fence that had been nagging at him for weeks, rode his property line checking for problems. To anyone watching, and he had to assume someone might be, he was just a rancher going about his business. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But his mind never stopped working on the problem. In 2 days, Brennan would realize Mara was gone. In 3, he'd start making serious efforts to find her. How long before those efforts reached this ranch? How long before Ethan would have to look powerful men in the eye and lie convincingly about harboring a runaway child bride? That evening, he brought Mara her meal and found her sitting at the small table, teaching herself letters by the light of the lantern. She'd found an old Bible on the shelves, one Sarah had kept down here for the people they'd hidden, and was sounding out words with fierce concentration. How are you holding up? Ethan asked, setting down the food. It's quiet, she said, but quiet is better than scared. And I'm good at being alone, had lots of practice. Something in her tone made Ethan pause. Your father, did he hurt you? Beyond the selling, I mean. He drank, she said simply. When he drank, he got mean. Not hitting mean, mostly, just words mean. Telling me I was worthless, that I was lucky anyone would want me at all. That I should be grateful Marcus Brennan was willing to take someone as pathetic as me off his hands. She looked up, her young face hard. I stopped believing him about 6 months ago. Figured out that people who tear you down are usually trying to make themselves feel bigger. But it still hurt. Words like that always hurt, Ethan agreed, even when we know they're lies. Are they lies, though? Mara's voice was small. Maybe I am worthless. Maybe that's why this is happening. Ethan pulled out the other chair and sat down heavily. Listen to me, Mara. You are not worthless. What's happening to you isn't happening because of anything you did or didn't do, anything you are or aren't. It's happening because your father made a terrible choice, and Marcus Brennan is a predator who uses law and money to take what decent men wouldn't dream of taking. That's on them. All of it. Not one bit of it is on you. She stared at him with those old young eyes. How do you know? Because I've seen enough of the world to know the difference between guilt and victimhood. You're a child caught in adult ugliness, and the fact that you had the clarity to say you were too young shows me you've got more wisdom than the men who tried to own you." A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. This time she didn't try to stop them. "I'm scared, Ethan. I'm so scared all the time. What if they find me? What if Brennan makes you tell? What if... Hey!" He reached across the table and took her hand, carefully, gently, the way you'd handle something precious and breakable. "Fear is smart right now. Fear keeps you careful. But don't let it convince you that you're powerless, because you're not. You ran. You asked for help. You spoke your truth. That's power, Mara. That's your power, and no one can take it from you." She gripped his hand tight, this small, scared, impossibly brave girl. And Ethan made a silent promise to the memory of his wife, to the conscience he'd tried to ignore for too long, to the simple human decency that separated men from monsters. He would protect this child, whatever it cost, even if it cost everything. The first full day passed in a rhythm of careful deception. Ethan rose before dawn, as was his habit, and went through the motions of ranch work with deliberate visibility. He rode to town for supplies, nodded to neighbors, made himself seen and unremarkable. Just another widower rancher buying flour and coffee, nothing worth remembering. When old Jack Peterson asked if he'd heard anything about the Brennan girl gone missing from Silver Creek, Ethan shook his head with practiced indifference. "News travels fast," he said, loading a sack of grain onto his horse. "Brennan's offering a reward," Jack said, leaning against the post with the casual posture of a man settling in for gossip. $200 for information leading to her return. Says she was abducted by her aunt, got the sheriff involved and everything. Ethan kept his face neutral, though his hands tightened on the rope securing his supplies. $200 is serious money. Guess he really wants her back. Well, she is his bride-to-be. Contract signed and everything, legal as Sunday. Jack spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Though between you and me, something don't sit right about a man his age marrying a girl that young. My granddaughter's 13. Can't imagine. Yeah, Ethan agreed quietly. Can't imagine. He rode home with the news sitting heavy in his gut. $200 was enough to make good men think twice about what they knew and didn't know. Enough to make neighbors start watching each other more carefully. The net was tightening faster than he'd hoped. That evening, when he brought Mara her meal, he found her pacing the small cellar like a caged animal. The lantern light caught the sheen of sweat on her forehead, despite the cool temperature underground. "You need to stay still," Ethan said, setting down the tray. "Sound carries through floorboards. If someone's in the barn above—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice tight. "I know, I'm trying, but it's so quiet down here. Too quiet. My thoughts get loud when everything else is silent." He understood that. After Sarah died, the silence of the house had been unbearable. He'd taken to talking to the horses just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. "Tell me about something good," he said, surprising himself. "Something from before all this. A happy memory." Mara stopped pacing and looked at him suspiciously, as if happiness might be a trap. Then her face softened slightly. "My mother," she said quietly. "Before she died, when I was little. She used to sing while she worked. Didn't matter what she was doing, cooking, washing, mending, she always sang. My father hated it, said it gave him headaches, but I loved it. Do you remember any of the songs?" "Some. Mostly just the feeling of them, like being wrapped in something warm and safe." Her voice cracked. "She died when I was 7. Fever took her in 3 days. After that, my father stopped being whatever good thing he might have been before. Started drinking more, working less. Started looking at me like I was a burden he couldn't wait to be rid of." Ethan lowered himself onto the bottom step, giving her space but staying present. "My wife used to sing too. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but she sang anyway. Drove the cattle half crazy, but it made her happy. That's what I miss most, I think. Not the perfect things about her, but the real things. The things that made her human." "How long has she been gone?" 3 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like forever." Mara sat down on the cot, her small frame seeming to collapse in on itself. "Does it get easier?" "Yes and no. The sharp edges of grief wear down over time. But there's always a space where someone used to be. You learn to walk around it instead of falling into it every day. That's not the same as easy, but it's better than the beginning. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two people bound by loss and circumstance. Then Mara asked the question that had clearly been eating at her. When they come, and they will come, what are you going to tell them? The truth, Ethan said, that I don't know where you are. But that's a lie. No, it's selective honesty. I know where you are in this moment, in this cellar. But I don't know where the girl they're looking for is, because that girl, the one they think they own, the one they believe has no choice, she doesn't exist. You're not property. You're not a bride. You're a child who deserves safety. That's who you really are. And I genuinely don't know where their fictional version of you is gone. A small smile touched Mara's lips. That's a very complicated way of lying. That's a very simple way of protecting the truth that matters. He stood, brushing dust from his pants. Try to rest. Tomorrow might be harder. He was right. The next morning, Ethan was mending fence line when he saw riders approaching. 3 of them, moving with purpose across his land like they had every right to be there. He set down his tools and waited, one hand resting casually on the fence post, the other near the pistol he'd started carrying since Mara arrived. The lead rider was a man Ethan recognized from previous trips to Silver Creek, Sheriff Wade Cunningham, a weathered man in his 50s whose badge had long ago stopped meaning justice and started meaning whoever paid the most. Flanking him were 2 men Ethan didn't know, but their type was familiar enough. Hired muscle, the kind who'd follow orders without asking questions as long as the money was good. "Mr. Cole," the sheriff said, reining in his horse 10 feet away. "Close enough to talk, far enough to draw if needed. Appreciate a moment of your time." "Sheriff," Ethan replied evenly, "you're a fair distance from Silver Creek. What brings you to my land?" "Looking for a missing girl. Mara Brennan. 13 years old, dark hair, thin build. Her father says she was taken by her aunt, Ruth Brennan. You know either of these women?" "Can't say I do. Why would they be here?" Cunningham's eyes were sharp despite the casual drawl in his voice. "Ruth Brennan left Silver Creek 3 days ago with the girl. Told folks she was visiting family, but the girl never came back. We've been checking ranches in a wide radius. Yours came up." "Came up how?" "Your wife had a reputation for helping people who didn't want to be found. Figured maybe that reputation survived her." Ethan felt anger flash hot in his chest but kept it from his face. "My wife helped people who deserved help. She's been dead 3 years. Whatever she did then has nothing to do with now." "So you're saying you haven't seen this girl or her aunt?" "I'm saying I live alone, work alone, and mind my own business. If someone came through my property, I didn't see them." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. "You mind if we look around, just to be thorough?" "Actually, I do mind," Ethan said pleasantly. "You've got no warrant, no cause, and no right to search my property. So unless you're planning to tell me I'm under arrest for something, I'd appreciate you getting on with your ride elsewhere." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Mr. Cole, I'm trying to be reasonable here. There's a girl missing, and her family wants her back. If you know something, her family," Ethan interrupted, "is the one who sold her to a man 40 years her senior. Maybe instead of harassing ranchers, you should be asking why a father would do that to his own child." The temperature of the conversation dropped several degrees. The hired men's hands drifted toward their weapons, and Cunningham's face went hard. "That's a legal marriage contract, witnessed and signed. What you're suggesting sounds an awful lot like interference with a lawful arrangement. What I'm suggesting is that some things are wrong even when they're legal. But that's philosophy, Sheriff, and I'm just a simple rancher, so unless you've got actual business here, I've got work to do." For a long moment, the standoff held. Ethan could feel the tension like a living thing, could see the calculations running behind Cunningham's eyes. How much trouble was it worth to push this? How much did Brennan want the girl back? How much was Ethan Cole willing to risk? Finally, Cunningham nodded slowly. "We'll be on our way. But Mr. Cole, if you do happen to see or hear anything about this girl, there's a reward being offered, $200. That's a lot of money for information." "I'll keep that in mind," Ethan said, "though I've found that some money comes with strings attached that aren't worth the tying." The sheriff touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Good day, Mr. Cole. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." They rode off, but Ethan noticed they didn't head directly back toward Silver Creek. Instead, they circled around, taking a route that would let them observe his ranch from different angles, checking for signs of recent visitors, fresh tracks, anything that might contradict his story. He forced himself to continue working, to not look toward the barn, to maintain the fiction of a man with nothing to hide. But his heart was hammering, and sweat that had nothing to do with physical labor dampened his shirt. That had been close. Too close. And they'd be back, probably with more men and less courtesy. That evening, when he descended into the cellar, he found Mara pressed into the far corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "I heard voices," she whispered. "Up above, in the barn. Someone was searching. I heard footsteps right over my head." Ethan cursed silently. So they had searched, probably while he was distracted with the sheriff. Snuck one man around while the other two kept him talking. Standard intimidation tactic. "But they didn't find you," he said firmly. "The cellar held. You're safe." "For how long?" Her voice rose, skating toward panic. "They know something. They'll keep coming back. Maybe next time with more men. Maybe next time they'll—" "Mara." He crossed the cellar and knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes directly. "Listen to me. I knew this would happen. I knew they'd come looking, and I'm still here, still protecting you. That hasn't changed." "But you heard them. They're watching you now. How are you supposed to bring me food if they're watching? How am I supposed to stay hidden if they keep searching?" These were good questions, practical questions, the kind that kept people alive in dangerous situations. The fact that she could think them despite her fear told Ethan she was stronger than she knew. "We adapt," he said simply. "I'll vary the times I come to the barn. Sometimes morning, sometimes evening, sometimes middle of the day. Make it look random, like normal ranch work. And I'll set up a signal system. If it's safe to talk, I'll whistle a specific tune before I open the trap door. If you hear anything else, you stay absolutely silent. Can you do that?" She nodded, though her whole body was trembling. "What was the sheriff like? Did he believe you?" "Doesn't matter if he believed me. Matters that he couldn't prove otherwise. And he can't, not without evidence. All he has is suspicion, and suspicion won't stand up to a determined lie." "I hate this," Mara said suddenly, fiercely. "I hate hiding like I did something wrong. I hate that they get to hunt me like an animal. I hate that you have to lie for me, risk everything for me, when all I did was refuse to be sold like cattle." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "The unfairness of it burns, doesn't it? But hate's just another kind of fire, Mara. It can keep you warm or it can consume you. You get to choose which." "How do you choose warm?" "By remembering what you're fighting for. Not against Brennan, not against your father, not even against the law. You're fighting for yourself, for your right to have a childhood, a future, choices. That's worth fighting for without letting the anger poison you." She uncurled slightly, her breathing slowing toward normal. "You sound like you've done this before. The fighting, I mean. Different fight, same principle. During the war years, my wife and I helped people escape bondage. We lied to authorities, hid fugitives, risked hanging if we were caught. Sarah used to say that some laws are so unjust that breaking them is the only moral choice. I didn't always agree with her, thought she was too idealistic, too willing to risk what we'd built. But she was right, and I'm going to honor her memory by being right this time too." Mara studied him with those disconcerting old young eyes. "You must have loved her very much." "More than I knew how to say when she was alive. Funny how death clarifies things. Makes you realize you should have been braver, should have stood stronger for what mattered. I can't go back and be better for her, but I can be better now, for you. Maybe that's a kind of redemption." "I don't think you need redemption," Mara said softly. "I think you're already good." "Good is a daily choice, not a permanent state. Now eat something. You're going to need your strength for whatever comes next." What came next was a week of escalating tension. Ethan spotted riders on distant ridges, watching his property through spyglasses. Twice more men came asking questions. Different men, but the same suspicion in their eyes. The reward increased to $300, then $400. Word spread through the territory that Marcus Brennan wanted his bride back and would pay handsomely for her return. Ethan varied his routine, making himself unpredictable. Some days he worked from dawn to dusk without visiting the cellar at all, leaving food and water in quantities that would last. Other days he went to the barn multiple times, always with legitimate reasons that would make sense to watching eyes. He became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement on his property, every change in the patterns of birds and animals that might indicate human presence. Mara, trapped underground, was going quietly stir-crazy. When he could visit safely, he found her teaching herself to read better using Sarah's old Bible, or exercising in the small space to keep her body from weakening. But the isolation was wearing on her. She stopped sleeping well, jumped at every sound, and developed a hollow look around her eyes that reminded Ethan of prisoners he'd seen during the war. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said one evening when he brought her dinner. "Do you think this can actually work? Or are we just delaying the inevitable?" He could have offered comfortable lies, but she deserved better. "I think we've bought time. How much time? I don't know. But every day you're not with Brennan is a day you're safe, and that matters. As for what happens long term," he paused, choosing words carefully, "we need a permanent solution. Hiding you here forever isn't sustainable." "What kind of solution?" "I've been thinking about that. There are places, cities back east, territories out west, where you could start over. New name, new life. Places Brennan's reach doesn't extend." "You mean running away forever, never coming back, never seeing my aunt again, or anyone I knew?" "I mean surviving," Ethan said bluntly. "Is that fair?" "No." "Is it what you deserve?" "No. But it might be what's necessary." Mara was quiet for a long time, her food untouched. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and tired. "I used to dream about running away. Before all this, when my father was drunk and mean, I'd imagine just walking out the door and never looking back. But in those dreams, I was running toward something, adventure, freedom, a better life. This isn't running toward anything. It's just running away from the bad thing, forever and ever, always looking over my shoulder. Sometimes survival is enough of a goal." "Is it?" She looked up at him, and her eyes were full of something harder than fear. "Or does that make me a coward? Does that mean Brennan wins?" Staying alive when someone powerful wants you dead or controlled isn't cowardice, it's resistance, and Brennan doesn't win unless he breaks you. As long as you keep your spirit, keep your sense of self, he's lost the only thing that really mattered, your submission. "I don't feel very resistant," Mara admitted. "I feel scared and small and like everything's out of my control." "Fear and resistance aren't opposites," Ethan said. "The bravest people I've ever known were terrified most of the time. They just didn't let the terror stop them from doing what needed doing. You ran when you could have accepted your fate. You asked for help instead of giving up. You're surviving in a cellar underground instead of standing at an altar beside a monster. That's resistance, Mara. That's you fighting back the only way you can right now." She picked at her food, taking small bites. "My aunt sent a letter," Ethan continued. "Got it at the general store yesterday. She made it to Lewiston, established herself there like we planned. She's asking after you, carefully, without revealing she knows where you are, playing her part well. Does she hate me for this? For making her leave? For putting you in danger? She loves you enough to risk everything to save you. That's not hate, that's the opposite." He stood, preparing to leave. "Get some rest. Tomorrow I'm riding to town again, going to ask some careful questions about legal options. Maybe there's a way to challenge the contract, or—" "There isn't," Mara interrupted. "My father signed it. I'm a minor. In the eyes of the law, I'm his property to dispose of as he sees fit. Any lawyer will tell you the same thing. The law isn't the only kind of justice." "What other kind is there?" Ethan paused at the base of the stairs, his hand on the rough wood. "The kind that looks a child in the eye and asks what she wants for her own life. The kind that values human dignity over legal contracts. The kind my wife believed in even when it cost her everything. That kind of justice isn't written down anywhere, but it's real. And sometimes, when enough people stand up for it, it becomes stronger than what's written in law books." He left her with that thought, climbing the stairs and securing the trapdoor behind him. The barn was dark and quiet. The only sounds, the soft breathing of horses and the rustle of hay. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. checking for any signs of intrusion or watching eyes. Nothing. For now. Back in the house, he lit a single lamp and sat at the table with paper and pencil. He needed a plan. A real plan. Something beyond hiding and hoping. Ruth's letter had included something interesting. A mention of a woman in Helena, a reformer who'd been making noise about children's rights and the legality of child marriages. Margaret Flynn, she was called, known for taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, for believing that justice and law weren't always the same thing. It was a thread, thin and uncertain, but it was something. He began composing a letter, carefully worded to explain the situation without revealing too much in case the letter was intercepted. A hypothetical case, he wrote. A friend's niece in a difficult situation. Could she advise on legal options? He was sealing the envelope when he heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast toward his ranch. His hand went to the rifle, and he moved to the window, staying back from the lamplight so he wouldn't be silhouetted as a target. 6 riders this time, approaching in a loose formation that suggested military training or practiced intimidation. They pulled up in his yard, and the lead rider dismounted with the confidence of a man who expected compliance. Marcus Brennan himself had come calling. Ethan recognized him from descriptions he'd heard in town. Tall, barrel-chested, somewhere past 50, but carrying himself like a younger man. Expensive clothes, well-kept beard, eyes that assessed everything with the calculation of someone used to converting the world into assets and debts. Behind him, 5 men sat their horses with the easy posture of people comfortable with violence. Ethan opened the door before Brennan could knock, stepping out onto the porch with the rifle held loose but visible in his hands. "Mr. Brennan," he said evenly, "you're on my land without invitation." "Ethan Cole," Brennan replied, his voice smooth as creek stones. "Forgive the intrusion. I've come about a matter of some urgency. May we speak like civilized men?" "We can speak from exactly where we are. State your business." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Very well. I'm looking for my bride-to-be, Mara Brennan. She was taken from Silver Creek by her aunt, and I have reason to believe they may have come this way. Have you seen either of them?" "Already answered that question for your sheriff. Answer hasn't changed." "Sheriff Cunningham can be overly respectful of property rights," Brennan said. "I'm a bit more direct. I'm offering $500 for information leading to Mara's return. That's serious money, Mr. Cole. Enough to make improvements to a ranch like this. New equipment, maybe expand your herd, all for a simple piece of information. And if I don't have that information? Then I'd have to wonder why a man who keeps to himself would refuse such a generous offer. Makes a person seem uncooperative." The threat was clear beneath the polite words. Ethan had dealt with men like Brennan before, men who believed their wealth entitled them to anything they wanted, who saw resistance as a personal insult that needed correcting. "I appreciate the offer," Ethan said carefully, "but I can't sell what I don't have. Now, unless you've got legal grounds to search my property, I'd appreciate you and your men moving along." Brennan's expression hardened. "Let me be clear, Mr. Cole. I will find that girl. She belongs to me by legal contract. Her father sold her to settle a debt, and I hold that debt. Whether she returns willingly or otherwise is immaterial. But those who help her, who hide her, who interfere with my legal right to claim what's mine, they'll find themselves facing consequences they can't imagine." "Consequences," Ethan repeated flatly. "That's an interesting word for threats." "Not threats, promises. I own half of Silver Creek. I have judges, sheriffs, and legislators in my pocket. I can make your life very difficult, Mr. Cole. I can tie you up in legal battles until you lose this ranch. I can have you arrested on fabricated charges. I can make you wish you'd been more cooperative." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Or you can simply tell me where the girl is, take your $500, and we all go about our business. Your choice." Ethan looked at the 5 men still mounted behind Brennan. They were waiting for a signal, ready to act on whatever order came. If this turned violent, he might get 1 or 2, but they'd overwhelm him eventually, and then they'd tear his ranch apart looking for Mara. But if he gave in now, if he let money or threats determine his actions, then everything Sarah had taught him about standing for what mattered would be proven hollow. He'd have to live with that betrayal for whatever years remained to him. Some choices weren't really choices at all. "I heard you out," Ethan said quietly. Now hear me. I don't know where your bride is, and I wouldn't tell you if I did. Because what you're doing, dressing up the purchase of a child in legal language and calling it marriage, that's evil, no matter how many contracts you've signed. So you can threaten me all you want, Mr. Brennan. You can bring your lawyers and your bought lawmen and your hired guns. But you're still not getting what you came for. Not from me. Not tonight. The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and the sound seemed to underline just how isolated Ethan's ranch was, how far from help or witnesses. Brennan's face had gone cold, empty of the pretense of civility. You're making a terrible mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. We'll see. Brennan remounted his horse with fluid ease. We'll see how long your principles hold when everything you've built starts crumbling around you. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Cole. What's left of it. They rode off into the darkness, and Ethan stood on his porch long after the sound of hoofbeats faded. His hands were shaking, not with fear exactly, but with the adrenaline aftermath of controlled violence that hadn't quite erupted. He'd made an enemy tonight, a powerful one, and there would be consequences. But in the cellar beneath his barn, a 13-year-old girl was safe for one more night. And somehow, that balanced the scales in a way money and threats never could. He went inside, checked the rifle's ammunition, and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. But tonight, he'd stood where Sarah would have wanted him to stand. That was enough to quiet his conscience, if not his fears. In the darkness underground, Mara had heard nothing of the confrontation. But she felt it somehow, the way animals sense storms before they arrive. She lay on her cot, clutching her rag doll, and prayed to anyone who might be listening that Ethan Cole's courage wouldn't cost him everything he'd built. Above ground, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles. But somewhere in that vast Montana night, lines were being drawn that would determine whether justice or power would prevail. The standoff had begun in earnest, and there was no going back for anyone involved. Dawn broke gray and uncertain, the kind of morning that promised nothing good. Ethan had barely slept, his mind cycling through scenarios and contingencies, each one ending in variations of disaster. He rose stiff and unrested, moving through his morning routine with mechanical precision while his thoughts remained on the confrontation to come. Because it would come, Brennan had made that clear. The only question was when and how hard. The answer arrived with the sun still low on the horizon. This time, there was no pretense of courtesy, no slow approach to give warning. A dozen riders came fast over the ridge, kicking up dust that hung in the still morning air like a declaration of intent. Ethan watched them from his porch, the rifle already in his hands, his body positioned where it could move quickly in any direction. He'd prepared for this through the sleepless night, moving certain items from the house to safer locations, making sure the barn showed no signs of recent disturbance, checking and rechecking that the cellar's trap door was invisible beneath its covering of hay. Sheriff Cunningham led the group this time, but Brennan rode beside him, and the men following carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who believed the law was on their side. Because it was. That was the bitter truth Ethan had to swallow. By every legal standard that existed in this territory, they had the right to search for Brennan's runaway bride, and Ethan had no right to interfere. They pulled up in a loose semicircle facing the porch, close enough to be intimidating, far enough to make a rifle shot ambitious. Cunningham dismounted, a paper clutched in his hand. "Mr. Cole he said formally, all the earlier casual politeness stripped away. "I have here a warrant signed by Judge Morrison, authorizing the search of these premises for Mara Brennan, a minor child who has absconded from her legal guardian's custody. You will stand aside and permit this search, or you will be arrested for obstruction of justice. Those are your only options." Ethan looked at the paper without taking it, then at Brennan, who sat his horse with the satisfied expression of a man who'd already won. "Legal guardian," Ethan said slowly. "That's an interesting way to describe a man who bought a child like livestock." "The nature of Mr. Brennan's relationship with his betrothed is not your concern," Cunningham replied. "The law recognizes his claim. That's all that matters." "Is it?" Ethan's voice was quiet, but it carried. "When did we decide the law was the same thing as right? When did having a piece of paper become more important than a child's safety?" One of the riders, a younger man with nervous hands, shifted uncomfortably. Ethan caught the movement and pressed the advantage. "How many of you have daughters?" he called out, addressing the group. "Granddaughters? Nieces? How many of you would stand by and watch a 13-year-old girl get handed over to a man old enough to be her grandfather, all because some paper says it's legal?" "That's enough," Brennan cut in sharply. "Sheriff, execute your warrant. This man is clearly harboring a fugitive." "I'm harboring nothing but my own business on my own land," Ethan countered. "And I'm exercising my right to speak truth to power, which, last I checked, wasn't a crime even in Silver Creek." Cunningham's jaw worked, frustration and something that might have been shame warring across his weathered face. "Mr. Cole, I don't want trouble here. Step aside. Let us search. And if the girl's not here, we'll be on our way." "And if I refuse?" "Then I arrest you. We search anyway. And you spend time in a cell while your ranch sits unattended. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. If Ethan resisted, they'd overwhelm him, search at their leisure, and almost certainly find Mara. But if he cooperated, let them search under his watchful eye, there was a chance, slim but real, that the cellar's concealment would hold. He lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately. "Search if you must. But you touch nothing that isn't related to your warrant. You damage my property, I'll have legal recourse of my own." "Fair enough," Cunningham said, though his tone suggested he found nothing fair about any of this. The men dismounted and spread out with practiced efficiency. 4 went to the house, turning over furniture, checking closets, looking under beds. 3 searched the outbuildings, the chicken coop, the small smokehouse. That left 5 heading toward the barn, and Ethan's heart began hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape. He followed them to the barn, forcing his pace to remain casual, unhurried. Inside, the horses nickered at the intrusion of strangers. The searchers began methodically working through the space, checking stalls, climbing into the loft, probing hay bales with long poles to ensure no one was hiding within. Ethan leaned against a support post, arms crossed, face carefully neutral. Every muscle in his body was tensed, ready. If they found the trap door, if Mara made a sound, if any detail betrayed her presence, he'd have seconds to act. What he'd do in those seconds, he didn't know. Attack armed men? Create a diversion? Die trying to protect a child he'd known for barely 2 weeks? Yes, something in him answered simply. Yes to all of it. One of the searchers, a thick-shouldered man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, approached the area where the trapdoor lay hidden. He began moving hay bales, methodical and thorough, getting closer with each one removed. Ethan's hand drifted toward his pistol, a movement so slight it might have been unconscious. The man shifted 3 bales, then 4. He was 2 feet from the trapdoor now. 1 more bale, and he'd see the outline of it in the floorboards, the slight depression where the door sat flush with the surrounding wood. "Find something?" Brennan's voice came from the barn entrance, sharp with anticipation. The scarred man paused, looking back. "Just checking thoroughly like you asked, Mr. Brennan. Lots of hay to move." "Then move it. We haven't got all day." The man bent to lift the next bale, the one directly atop the trapdoor, and Ethan's fingers closed around his pistol grip. Time seemed to stretch and slow, each second expanding into an eternity where every possible future branched and converged. In one future, the trapdoor was discovered and violence erupted. In another, Mara stayed hidden and everyone walked away. In a third, something Ethan couldn't predict changed everything. The scarred man's hands closed around the bale. He lifted, and as he did, one of the horses in the back stall let out a shrill whinny and began kicking at its door with enough force to shake the barn walls. The sound was explosive in the confined space, and every man jumped, hands going to weapons. "Easy!" Ethan called out, using the distraction to move toward the agitated horse. "She spooks at strangers. Let me calm her before she hurts herself." He moved past the scarred man, past the trap door that was now visible beneath where the bale had been. But the searcher's attention had shifted to the commotion, his eyes on the kicking horse rather than the floor beneath his feet. Ethan reached the stall and began murmuring to the mare in low, soothing tones, making a show of checking her over while his mind raced. The horse, Sally, a temperamental bay mare he'd bought cheap because of her unpredictable nature, continued her performance, tossing her head and rolling her eyes dramatically. Ethan had never been more grateful for an animal's bad temper. He worked slowly, drawing out the calming process, giving the searchers time to lose interest in that particular corner of the barn. And they did. The scarred man, satisfied that nothing was hidden in the hay pile he'd already disturbed, moved on to other areas. The bale that had covered the trap door remained where he'd set it, off to the side, leaving the door partially exposed. But in the dim light of the barn, with attention elsewhere, it blended into the floorboards like it was meant to be there. Ethan kept working with Sally, his hands steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. Finally, he led her back into the stall and secured the door, then turned to find Brennan watching him with narrow, suspicious eyes. Temperamental horse, Brennan observed, got her cheap for exactly that reason. Sometimes unpredictable is all a man can afford, or sometimes unpredictable is useful for creating diversions. They stared at each other across the barn, two men who understood exactly what game was being played. Brennan knew something was wrong here, could feel it the way predators sense hidden prey. But feeling and proving were different things, and without proof, even his considerable power had limits. "Search is complete, Mr. Brennan," one of the men called from the barn entrance. "No sign of the girl in any of the structures." "Search again," Brennan ordered. "We've been thorough." "I said search again. Every building, every corner. Someone doesn't defend an empty ranch this hard without reason." So they searched again, even more invasively this time. They pulled up floorboards in the house, checked the well, dug through the storage shed. In the barn, they moved every bale of hay, every tool, every piece of equipment. The scarred man even walked directly across the trapdoor twice, his boots thudding on the wood that concealed Mara's hiding place. But the cellar held. The trapdoor, built by Ethan's careful hands and designed to be invisible, remained undetected. And beneath it, Mara stayed absolutely silent, barely breathing, trusting that the man who'd promised to protect her knew what he was doing. 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun climbed higher and frustration began showing in the searchers' movements, the way they worked with less care and more violence, kicking at things rather than moving them. Finally, Cunningham approached Brennan, his face flushed from exertion. "She's not here, Marcus. We've torn this place apart twice over. If she was here, we'd have found her. Or he's hidden her too well. Or she was never here to begin with." The sheriff's tone had gone flat, tired. "I've executed your warrant. I've allowed a search far more invasive than the paper authorized. I've got a dozen witnesses who'll testify this ranch was thoroughly examined. I can't justify staying longer." Brennan's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his face mottled with anger. "She's here. I can feel it." Feelings don't hold up in court, even when you're the one who owns the judge. Cunningham's words came out sharper than he probably intended, and he quickly added, "We'll keep looking elsewhere. Expand the search radius, but we're done here." For a long moment, Brennan didn't move. Then he turned to Ethan, who'd been watching the entire process from the porch, and spoke with venomous clarity. "This isn't over, Cole. Not by a long shot. I will find her. And when I do, I'll remember everyone who stood in my way." "I'm sure you will," Ethan replied evenly. "Just like you remember your 3 previous wives, I imagine." The words landed like a slap. Several of the searchers looked at Brennan with new expressions: curiosity, wariness, even something that might have been disgust. The deaths of Brennan's wives were known facts in Silver Creek, but rarely spoken of directly. Bringing them up now, in front of his hired men, was a calculated insult that couldn't be ignored. Brennan's face went white with rage. He took 3 steps toward the porch, his hand moving toward his hip where a pistol rested. "You want to say that again?" Ethan didn't move, didn't reach for his own weapon, just met Brennan's eyes with calm certainty. "I think I was clear enough the first time. But if you need repetition, 3 wives, 3 convenient deaths, and now you want a 4th who's barely old enough to understand what marriage means. Makes a man wonder about your intentions." "You're calling me a murderer." "I'm observing facts and letting people draw their own conclusions." The standoff crystallized, everything else falling away until it was just 2 men and the violence simmering between them. The hired men shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were supposed to intervene or witness. Cunningham's hand moved to his own weapon, though whether to stop Brennan or back him up was unclear. Then a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." Everyone turned. A wagon had arrived while they were focused on each other, and from it stepped a woman Ethan had never seen before. She was perhaps 60, tall and straight-backed, dressed in dark traveling clothes that spoke of means and purpose. Her face was weathered but sharp, her eyes the kind that had seen through countless lies and wouldn't tolerate one more. "Who the hell are you?" Brennan demanded. "Margaret Flynn," she replied, walking toward them with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Attorney at law, admitted to practice in Montana Territory and 3 other jurisdictions. I'm here regarding the matter of Mara Brennan and the questionable legality of her betrothal contract." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. The letter he'd sent had found its mark faster than he'd dared hope. Margaret Flynn had actually come. Brennan's expression shifted from rage to calculation. "This is none of your concern, Mrs. Flynn. This is a family matter." "Miss Flynn," she corrected sharply. "And it became my concern when I received evidence that a child is being sold into marriage with a man 40 years her senior. The law has something to say about that, Mr. Brennan. So do I." "The law is on my side. I have a contract, signed by her father, not by her, which brings up interesting questions about consent and the rights of minors to refuse arrangements made on their behalf." Flynn pulled a leather case from her wagon and extracted papers. "I've been doing research, Mr. Brennan, into your previous marriages, among other things. The pattern of young brides and untimely deaths is quite remarkable. Almost statistically impossible, one might say." The clearing had gone deadly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "You're treading on dangerous ground," Brennan said softly. "I've been treading on dangerous ground my entire career. It's where the interesting cases live." Flynn turned to Cunningham. "Sheriff, I'm formally requesting that you suspend any search for Mara Brennan until the legality of the marriage contract can be properly examined by a court not beholden to Mr. Brennan's financial interests." "I don't take orders from lawyers," Cunningham replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "You take orders from the law, and the law says a contract signed under duress involving a minor who cannot legally consent may be void. I have precedents from 3 territories and 1 state. Would you like to hear them?" The judge already approved. Judge Morrison, who coincidentally handles all of Mr. Brennan's business affairs and sits on the board of his mining company, hardly an impartial arbiter. Flynn's voice was crisp, factual, devastating. "I've already filed motions with the territorial court in Helena. Real judges, Mr. Brennan, ones who don't owe you money or favors." Brennan's face had gone from white to red, his hands trembling with suppressed fury. "You can't stop this. The contract is legal." "Is it?" Flynn interrupted. "Let's examine that claim. The bride is 13 years old, the groom is 52. The bride's father sold her to settle a gambling debt, making this more akin to human trafficking than a traditional marriage arrangement. The bride herself has fled rather than submit, which any reasonable court would interpret as a clear lack of consent. And the groom has a documented history of young wives meeting untimely ends, which suggests a pattern of predatory behavior that no court should endorse." She stepped closer to Brennan, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more threat than shouting ever could. "I've dedicated my life to fighting men like you, Mr. Brennan, men who use wealth and power to purchase what should never be for sale. And I'm very, very good at what I do. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw your search. You're going to wait while the courts examine this contract with appropriate scrutiny. And if you attempt any further intimidation or harassment of anyone involved in this case, I will personally ensure that every newspaper from here to Washington knows exactly what you are and what you've done." "You're bluffing." "Am I? Test me, please. I would love the opportunity to make an example of you in front of the entire territory." The standoff held for another long moment. Then Brennan turned sharply to his men. "Mount up. We're leaving." "But Mr. Brennan," one of them began. "I said we're leaving. This isn't over, but it's not happening here. Not today." They mounted with varying degrees of reluctance, some clearly eager to be gone, others confused by the sudden retreat. Cunningham looked between Flynn and Brennan like a man watching his comfortable world crack apart. "Sheriff," Flynn said pleasantly, "I trust you'll inform Judge Morrison that his handling of this case will be subject to review by higher courts. I'm sure he'll want to ensure all his paperwork is in order." Cunningham nodded stiffly and mounted his own horse. The group began riding out, but Brennan paused, looking back at Ethan with pure hatred in his eyes. You made a powerful enemy today, Cole. I'll sleep fine anyway, Ethan replied. We'll see how long that lasts. Brennan spurred his horse and rode after the others, leaving dust and implied threats hanging in the air. Ethan stood on his porch, watching them disappear over the ridge, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Beside him, Margaret Flynn set down her leather case and allowed herself a small smile. That went better than I expected, she said. You came, Ethan managed, his voice rough with emotion. I sent that letter hoping you might advise, but you actually came. Of course I came. When I read about a 13-year-old being sold to a known predator, what else would I do? Write a strongly worded response? This required presence, not correspondence. She studied him with keen eyes. Where is she? Safe. Hidden. I'll bring her up now that they're gone. Don't. Not yet. Flynn glanced toward where the riders had vanished. Brennan strikes me as the type who might double back, try to catch us off guard. Give it an hour, make sure they're truly gone. Then we'll talk, all of us together. There's much to discuss. Ethan nodded, still processing. How did you know to come now? My letter only went out 3 days ago. Your letter reached me 2 days ago. I left immediately, and when I arrived in the area this morning, I heard about the search party heading to the Cole Ranch. Seemed like a good time to make an entrance. She smiled. Dramatic timing is half of effective advocacy. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. We've won a delay, not the war. Brennan's type doesn't give up easily, and he has resources we're only beginning to understand. But at least now we have time to build a proper legal defense instead of just hiding and hoping. They waited, as Flynn suggested, a full hour before Ethan went to the barn. He whistled the all-clear signal and opened the trapdoor to find Mara pressed against the far wall, her face pale and streaked with tears. It's over, he said gently. They're gone, and we have help now, real help. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs and emerged into the barn's filtered sunlight like someone returning from the dead. When she saw Margaret Flynn waiting in the yard, something in her expression shifted from terror to tentative hope. Miss Mara Brennan, I presume, Flynn said, approaching with measured calm. My name is Margaret Flynn. I'm an attorney, and I'm here to ensure that your voice is heard in all of this. Not your father's voice, not Mr. Brennan's, yours. Mara looked at Ethan, who nodded encouragement, then back to Flynn. My voice, she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. Does my voice matter? In the law? It should, Flynn replied. It doesn't always, which is why we have work to do. But I've spent 30 years making courts listen to voices they'd rather ignore. I think I can make them listen to yours. What do I have to do? First, you have to tell me everything. The truth, all of it, no matter how difficult. Then we build a case not just against the contract, but against the system that allowed it to exist. And then, when the time comes, you'll need to speak your truth in a courtroom. Can you do that? Mara's hand found Ethan's, gripping tight. If it means I don't have to marry him? If it means other girls won't be sold like I was? Then yes, I can do that. Flynn's expression softened with something like admiration. You're braver than you know, child. Now let's go inside and start planning how to turn that bravery into freedom. They spent the rest of the day in Ethan's house, Flynn taking meticulous notes as Mara told her story. The gambling debts, the secret negotiations, the moment she learned she'd been sold, the terror of knowing what awaited her. Flynn asked difficult questions and accepted difficult answers, building a picture of systematic abuse dressed up in legal formality. As evening approached, Flynn sat back and reviewed her notes. This is strong, she said finally. Very strong. The lack of consent, the age disparity, the financial coercion, and especially the pattern with Brennan's previous wives. Any reasonable court would void this contract and possibly pursue criminal charges against your father for human trafficking. Any reasonable court, Mara repeated. But you said Judge Morrison isn't reasonable. Which is why we're taking this to Helena, to territorial judges who don't owe Brennan anything. It will take time, weeks, possibly months. Can you handle staying hidden that long? Mara looked at the cellar's trap door, visible through the barn door, then at Ethan. I can handle whatever it takes. I'm not going back, not ever. Good. Because Brennan will fight this. He'll use every resource, every connection, every dirty trick in his arsenal. He sees you as property he's purchased, and men like him don't accept losing what they consider theirs. Let him fight, Ethan said quietly. He'll find we can fight too. Flynn nodded approvingly. That's the spirit we'll need. Now, practical matters. Mara can't stay in that cellar indefinitely. It's not healthy, physically or mentally. But she also can't be visible. Mr. Cole, do you have any trusted friends? People who might provide shelter without asking dangerous questions? Ethan thought of the network Sarah had built during the war years, people who'd helped hide fugitives and ask no questions. Some were dead now, others scattered, but a few remained. Maybe. I'll need to make careful inquiries. Do so. In the meantime, I'll return to Helena and begin formal proceedings. I'll also reach out to some colleagues, journalists, reformers, people who can make noise about this case in ways that make it harder for Brennan to operate in shadows. She stood, gathering her papers. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. Are you both prepared for that? We're prepared, Mara said, and her voice held a certainty that belied her 13 years. I've been scared for so long, but I think I'm done being just scared. I think I'm ready to be angry instead, angry enough to fight. Flynn smiled. Anger, properly channeled, is a powerful tool for justice. Use it well, child. Now I must go before darkness makes travel dangerous. Mr. Cole, I'll send word through the general store when I have updates. Look for letters from my sister Abigail. That will be our code. She departed in the same decisive manner she'd arrived, leaving Ethan and Mara standing in the fading light, both feeling like the world had shifted beneath them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Do you think she can really win? Mara asked quietly. I think she's given us something we didn't have before, a real chance. What we do with that chance is up to us. That night, Mara slept in the house instead of the cellar, curled up by the fire with blankets wrapped around her. Ethan kept watch from the window, rifle across his lap, eyes on the darkness beyond his property. Somewhere out there, Marcus Brennan was plotting his next move. But for tonight, the girl was safe, and they had an advocate with the knowledge and courage to fight in courts instead of just barns and cellars. It wasn't victory, but it was hope, and hope was enough to build on. The days that followed were tense but different. Flynn's intervention had bought them time and legitimacy. The search parties stopped coming, though Ethan occasionally spotted watchers on distant ridges, men paid to keep track of his movements. Mara moved between the cellar and the house, depending on the level of threat, slowly regaining color in her cheeks and strength in her spirit. Letters arrived from Abigail, written in Flynn's precise hand, detailing progress in Helena, motions filed, judges consulted, newspaper editors intrigued by the story of a child bride and a predatory tycoon. The machinery of justice, slow but inexorable, had begun to turn. And with each letter, Mara's hope grew stronger. Her belief that maybe, just maybe, she might actually have a future that belonged to her and no one else. But Brennan wasn't idle. Reports filtered through from Silver Creek of his growing fury, his public declarations that he'd been wronged, his promises that the law would vindicate his rights. He hired lawyers of his own, filed counter-motions, used his influence to pressure judges and officials. The battle was engaged on multiple fronts, and the outcome remained far from certain. Through it all, Ethan maintained his ranch, kept Mara safe, and prepared for whatever came next. He'd crossed a line that day on his porch, chosen a side in a conflict that could cost him everything. But every time he saw Mara smile, a real smile, not the haunted expression she'd worn when she first arrived, he knew the choice had been right, whatever the price. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Sarah had known that. Now Ethan knew it too, and he wouldn't forget again. 3 weeks passed in a strange suspension between war and peace. The watchers on the ridges came and went, Brennan's eyes tracking Ethan's every movement but making no direct approach. Letters from Margaret Flynn arrived with increasing frequency, each one detailing small victories in Helena, a sympathetic judge assigned to the case, a newspaper editor willing to publish the story, affidavits from women in Silver Creek who'd known Brennan's previous wives and remembered things they'd been too afraid to speak aloud before. But Brennan was fighting back with equal determination. His lawyers filed motions claiming parental rights, property rights, breach of contract. They argued that the girl had been manipulated by outside agitators, that her father's signature was binding regardless of her wishes, That Flynn was a troublemaker with a history of interfering in legitimate business arrangements. Money changed hands in dark corners, and suddenly witnesses who'd been willing to testify developed convenient memory problems or left town entirely. Mara spent her days in a peculiar limbo, half prisoner and half protected, moving between the cellar when danger seemed imminent and the house when Ethan judged it safe. She'd grown thinner despite his efforts to feed her properly, the stress carving hollows beneath her cheekbones and shadows under her eyes. But she'd also grown stronger in ways that couldn't be measured physically. The terrified girl who'd arrived in Ruth's wagon had been replaced by someone harder, more determined, someone who'd looked at the machinery trying to crush her and decided to fight back instead of submit. She spent hours practicing what she'd say in court, rehearsing her testimony with Ethan playing the role of hostile lawyer. Her voice would shake at first, but she'd push through, finding strength in repetition and purpose. Sometimes she'd break down afterward, crying with frustration at her own fear, but she always came back the next day ready to try again. "Tell me again why it matters," she said one evening, sitting at Ethan's table with Flynn's latest letter spread before them. "Why my voice matters when the law says it doesn't." Ethan set down the coffee he'd been drinking and considered the question seriously. "The law is written by people, Mara, and people make mistakes, let their prejudices and self-interest corrupt what's supposed to be just. But when enough voices speak up, when enough people refuse to accept unjust laws, those laws can change. Your voice matters because it's true, and truth has a power that lies can't match forever." "That sounds like something your wife would have said." "It is. She said it to me more times than I can count, trying to convince me that hiding people in that cellar was worth the risk. I didn't always believe her then, but I believe it now." Mara traced the edge of the letter with one finger, her young face thoughtful. "Miss Flynn wrote that the hearing is scheduled for next month, that I'll have to testify in front of judges and Brennan and everyone. I'm scared, Ethan. What if I freeze? What if I can't say what needs saying when it matters most?" "Then you take a breath, remember why you're there, and you try again. Fear doesn't make you weak, Mara. Acting despite fear is what makes you strong." "I don't feel strong." "You ran away from a forced marriage. You've survived weeks in hiding. You've agreed to face your abuser in court instead of just disappearing and hoping he forgets about you. That's strength even if it doesn't feel like it from the inside." She managed a small smile at that, but it faded quickly. "What if we lose? What if the judges decide the contract is legal and I have to go back?" It was the question that haunted Ethan's sleepless nights, the nightmare scenario he couldn't quite prevent his mind from exploring. "Then we find another way. I won't let you go back to him, Mara. I give you my word on that. But if the law says, then we'll break the law. We'll run, hide you somewhere Brennan can't reach, start over with new names in a new territory, whatever it takes." "You'd do that? Risk everything? Become a fugitive just for me?" Ethan met her eyes steadily. "In a heartbeat. Some things are more important than staying on the right side of unjust laws. Sarah taught me that, and I won't forget the lesson again." Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me. You're not making me do anything. I'm choosing this, same as I chose to hide you that first night. Now stop worrying about me and focus on getting ready for that hearing. We're going to win this the right way if we can, but either way, you're not going back. That's settled." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching fast. Ethan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. But the rider who came into view wasn't one of Brennan's men. It was a woman, older, riding with the desperation of someone fleeing or seeking, her clothes dust-covered from hard travel. "It's Aunt Ruth," Mara gasped, recognizing her before Ethan did. She moved toward the door, but Ethan stopped her with a gentle hand. "Let me make sure she's alone first. Stay back from the windows." He stepped onto the porch as Ruth Brennan dismounted, nearly falling in her haste. She looked like she'd aged years in the weeks since he'd seen her, her face drawn and her hand shaking as she tied her horse to the rail. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thank the heavens you're here. I need to see Mara. Is she safe? She's safe," Ethan assured her, scanning the horizon for any sign Ruth had been followed. "But what are you doing here? I thought you were staying in Lewiston, maintaining distance." "I was. But things have changed. Bad things." Ruth climbed the steps, swaying slightly. May I come in? I've been writing for 2 days straight. I need to tell you both what's happened. Ethan led her inside, and Mara rushed to her aunt, embracing her with the desperate intensity of someone who'd thought they might never see their family again. Ruth held her niece close, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You're all right," she kept saying. "You're all right. I was so afraid." "I'm fine, Aunt Ruth. Mr. Cole has taken good care of me, and we have a lawyer now, a real one, who's fighting for me in court." Ruth pulled back, studying Mara's face. "I heard about Margaret Flynn. Words spread all the way to Lewiston, but that's not why I came." She looked at Ethan, her expression grave. "Your ranch is in danger. Brennan's planning something. I don't know all the details, but I have friends in Silver Creek, people who owe me favors. One of them got word to me that Brennan's hired men to come here, not to search this time, but to do something worse." "How much worse?" Ethan asked quietly. "Burning worse. Destroying worse. He's going to make it look like an accident, a fire in the barn maybe, something that would force you off the land or at least distract you long enough for him to make another grab for Mara. It's supposed to happen soon, maybe in the next few days." The news settled over the room like ash. Ethan had known Brennan wouldn't give up, but he'd hoped the legal proceedings would keep the man occupied, make him hesitant to do anything that might prejudice his case. Apparently, desperation or rage had overcome caution. "When?" Ethan asked. "My source didn't know exactly. Just soon. I came as fast as I could to warn you." Ruth turned to Mara. "Sweetheart, you need to leave here. It's not safe anymore. We can go back to Lewiston together, hide you somewhere Brennan can't—" "No," Mara said firmly. "I'm not running anymore. The hearing is in 3 weeks. If I disappear now, it'll look like I'm guilty of something, like I can't face Brennan in court. I won't give him that satisfaction." "But if the ranch burns, then we'll deal with it," Ethan interrupted. "But Mara's right. Running now would undermine everything Flynn's built. We need to stay, protect what we can, and trust that the legal process will work." "And if it doesn't?" Ruth's voice was sharp with fear. "If Brennan's men come with torches and guns, what then?" "Then we fight." Ethan's tone was flat, factual. "I've got supplies hidden off the property, contingency plans if the ranch becomes untenable. And I'm not alone anymore. There are people who've been watching this situation, good people who don't like what Brennan represents. If he moves against me openly, violently, he'll find more resistance than he expects." Ruth looked between them, seeing the determination in both faces, and slowly nodded. "All right, but I'm staying. If there's going to be trouble, you'll need extra hands and eyes. I'm not much in a fight, but I can watch, warn, help evacuate if it comes to that." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. Mara is my niece. You've risked everything to protect her. The least I can do is stand with you when the danger comes." She straightened her spine, and for a moment Ethan saw the woman Sarah had described years ago, someone who'd helped more than one desperate soul find freedom when the world said they had no right to it. "All right," he agreed, "but you follow my lead when trouble comes. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Agreed?" "Agreed." They spent the evening preparing. Ethan moved supplies from the barn to the house, reasoning that if fire was the threat, at least the dwelling might survive. He checked his weapons, made sure ammunition was accessible, reviewed escape routes with both women. Ruth took over cooking duties, insisting that Ethan needed to focus on defense while she handled the practical necessities of keeping them fed. Mara watched it all with wide eyes, the reality of their situation settling over her like a weight. This wasn't abstract anymore, wasn't just legal maneuvering and courtroom strategies. This was the moment when Brennan's patience ran out, and violence became the tool he'd use to reclaim what he considered his property. That night, Ethan took first watch, sitting on the porch with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the darkness beyond the ranch. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere out there, men were being paid to bring fire and fear. The only question was when. The answer came 2 nights later. Ethan was on watch again, Ruth and Mara sleeping inside when he smelled it, smoke, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from the direction of his northern pasture. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, scanning for the source. There, against the horizon, a flicker of orange that grew even as he watched. "Ruth," he called, keeping his voice low but urgent. "Wake up. We've got fire. She appeared at the door within seconds, Mara right behind her. They could all see it now, flames spreading through the dry grass of the pasture, pushed by the wind toward the ranch buildings. Is it natural? Ruth asked, though they all knew the answer. No lightning tonight, no reason for spontaneous combustion. This is Brennan's work. Ethan was already moving, throwing water buckets to Ruth, grabbing shovels. We need to create a fire break between the pasture and the buildings. Ruth, you and Mara start wetting down the barn walls. I'll try to stop the fire's advance. Alone? Mara's voice was frightened. You can't fight a prairie fire alone. I won't be alone for long. If I know my neighbors, they've already seen the smoke. Help will come. He hoped that was true. Hoped that the bonds of frontier community would prove stronger than Brennan's money and intimidation. But we need to slow it down until they arrive. Now go! They scattered to their tasks. Ethan ran toward the advancing fire with a wet burlap sack, beginning to beat at the flames on the southern edge, trying to drive them back or at least redirect them. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, and within minutes he was coughing and half-blinded. But he kept working, beating at the flames with desperate determination. Behind him, he could hear Ruth and Mara splashing water against the barn walls, creating a wet barrier that might survive if the fire reached it. The horses inside were screaming, panicked by the smell of smoke, and he knew they'd need to be released soon or risk them dying of fear and heat. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching fast. His hand went to his pistol, uncertain if these were rescuers or Brennan's men come to ensure the fire finished its work. But the voice that called out was familiar. Welcome. Cole! We saw the smoke! Where do you need us? It was Tom Henderson, who owned the ranch 5 miles east. Behind him were 6 other men, neighbors Ethan knew by sight, if not by name, all carrying water and tools and grim determination on their faces. Fire break, Ethan shouted back. We need to cut a line between the fire and the buildings. If we can starve it of fuel, we know what to do, Henderson interrupted, already dismounting and organizing the men into teams. You get those horses out of the barn before they kill themselves. We'll handle the fire. Ethan ran for the barn, finding Ruth and Mara still frantically wetting down the walls. I need to release the horses. Get clear in case they stampede. He threw open the barn doors and began opening stalls, trusting the horses' survival instincts to drive them away from the smoke and flames. They burst out in a terrified rush, Sally in the lead, galloping toward the distant creek where instinct told them safety lay. The barn emptied quickly, leaving only the smell of fear and the sound of men shouting as they fought the fire. Ethan rejoined the firefighters, working alongside men who'd come to help despite the risk, despite knowing that aiding him might bring Brennan's wrath down on them too. They dug and beat and smothered, creating a ragged line of bare earth that the fire couldn't easily cross. Behind them, the barn stood wet and waiting, a target that refused to ignite. The battle lasted 3 hours. By the time they'd beaten the fire back to scattered embers and smoking grass, dawn was breaking gray and exhausted over the horizon. The men stood around in small groups, faces blackened by smoke, hands blistered from shovels and wet sacking, but the ranch still stood, damaged, threatened, but not destroyed. Tom Henderson approached Ethan, accepting a ladle of water from Ruth with a nod of thanks. That was no accident, he said flatly. Fire started in 3 places at once, evenly spaced. Someone set this deliberately. I know, Ethan replied. Brennan? Most likely, though proving it will be another matter. Henderson spat into the scorched earth. Man's getting bold, setting fires, threatening neighbors. Time was, we'd have handled someone like that ourselves, law or no law. Times have changed. Maybe they shouldn't have. Henderson looked at the other men, then back to Ethan. We know what you're doing here. Why that girl's hiding. Word gets around and not all of us are happy with how Brennan does business. So here's what I'm offering. You need help, you call. We'll come. Not saying we'll go to war with Silver Creek, but we'll defend what's ours. And right now, you're one of ours. The simple declaration hit Ethan harder than he'd expected. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as alone, isolated by choice and circumstance, that the idea of community standing behind him felt foreign and precious at once. I appreciate that, he managed. More than I can say. Then say it by winning, Get that girl her freedom, legal and proper. Show Brennan that money and power don't make everything right. Henderson tipped his hat to Ruth and Mara. Ladies, you need anything? My ranch is 2 hours east. Doors always open. The men departed as the sun fully cleared the horizon, leaving Ethan, Ruth, and Mara standing in the yard surveying the damage. The northern pasture was a blackened ruin, but the buildings had survived. The horses would come back once they felt safe. The ranch could be repaired, rebuilt, made whole again. But something had changed in that night of fire and fear. A line had been crossed, and Brennan had shown his hand. He wasn't willing to wait for the courts anymore. He was taking direct action, consequences be damned. He'll try again, Mara said quietly, staring at the burned earth. This was just the first attack. He'll keep coming until he gets what he wants or destroys you completely. Let him try, Ruth said, her voice hard. He's made a mistake. He's shown everyone what he really is, a bully and a coward who sets fires in the night. That's going to cost him in ways he hasn't figured out yet. She was right. By the next evening, riders were arriving with offers of support, supplies to help rebuild, and most importantly, sworn statements willing to testify about the fire's suspicious origin. Margaret Flynn, when she received word through a fast rider Ethan sent to Helena, responded with a flurry of legal action, motions to revoke Brennan's bail on the contract dispute, requests for protective orders, formal complaints to territorial authorities about arson and attempted murder. The legal web around Brennan was tightening, but so was his desperation. 3 days after the fire, Sheriff Cunningham returned, this time with a different kind of paper, a summons for Mara to appear before Judge Morrison in Silver Creek for a preliminary hearing on the marriage contract. This isn't the Helena hearing, Flynn wrote in an urgent letter. This is Brennan trying to force a decision in his own territory before we can get to neutral courts. Do not let Mara go to Silver Creek. It's a trap. I'm filing emergency motions to block this summons, but it may take time. Stay strong, stay hidden. We're so close now. But Judge Morrison, emboldened by Brennan's money or too compromised to care about proper procedure, sent a second order. If Mara didn't appear within 1 week, a warrant would be issued for her arrest and for Ethan's arrest as an accomplice to kidnapping. The stakes had been raised again, forcing a confrontation that none of them wanted but couldn't avoid. We could run, Ruth suggested during an emergency council in Ethan's kitchen. Take Mara north, across into Canada maybe. Start over where Brennan can't reach. And spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder? Ethan shook his head. No, we've come too far to quit now. Flynn says the Helena hearing is in 2 weeks. If we can delay Morrison's deadline, push it past that date, the territorial court ruling will supersede his local authority. How do we delay a judge who's in Brennan's pocket? By making it politically impossible for him to rule the way Brennan wants. We need publicity, public pressure, evidence so overwhelming that even Morrison can't ignore it without destroying his own credibility. You make it sound simple, Mara said, but her voice held something new. Not fear, but a kind of fierce determination that reminded Ethan of Sarah in her most stubborn moments. But I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of waiting for men to decide my fate in rooms I'm not allowed into. Maybe it's time I spoke up myself, where everyone can hear me. What are you suggesting? Ruth asked carefully. Mara stood, pacing the small kitchen with nervous energy. I want to go to Silver Creek, not to Morrison's courtroom, but to the town square. I want to stand in front of everyone and tell my story. Let them see I'm not property, not a commodity. Let them hear from my own mouth why I'd rather hide in a cellar than marry Marcus Brennan. Make them choose. Are they going to stand with a child telling the truth, or a rich man defending his right to buy one? That's dangerous, Ethan said immediately. Brennan's men are everywhere in Silver Creek. You'd be exposed, vulnerable. I'm vulnerable here too. The fire proved that. Mara's voice was steady, certain. But at least this way, I'm choosing my ground. I'm speaking my truth in daylight where everyone can see. Flynn says truth has power. Well, let's test that. Let's see if people's consciences are stronger than Brennan's money. Ruth and Ethan exchanged glances, both seeing the logic and the terrible risk in equal measure. It was a gamble, staking everything on the hope that ordinary people, when confronted with obvious injustice, would choose correctly. Flynn would need to be there, Ethan said slowly, to give it legal weight, protect you from arrest. I'll send for her immediately, Ruth said. If we're doing this, we do it right. Full public testimony, documented and witnessed, with legal protection in place. And I'll come with you, Ethan added, armed and ready. Brennan tries anything in public, in front of witnesses, and he'll lose whatever moral authority he's pretending to have. So we're agreed. Mara looked between them, this girl who'd grown from terrified child to determined advocate in a matter of weeks. We take the fight to him, in his own town, and we trust that truth is stronger than corruption? We're agreed, Ethan said, but we do it smart. Flynn coordinates, we have backup, and at the first sign it's going wrong, we pull you out. Courage is one thing, suicide is another. The letter went out to Helena that night, carried by Tom Henderson's fastest rider with instructions to spare no horse in getting there quickly. Flynn's response came back within 2 days, and it was everything they'd hoped for. Yes, she'd come. Yes, she'd provide legal protection, and yes, she believed public testimony might be the lever they needed to force Morrison's hand, or at least delay him long enough for the territorial court to rule. But, her letter warned, this will provoke Brennan beyond anything we've done before. Be prepared for retaliation, be prepared for violence, and be prepared for the possibility that even truth spoken in daylight might not be enough to overcome entrenched power. Have an escape plan ready. 5 days later, on a clear Saturday morning, when Silver Creek's town square would be full of people doing their weekly business, a wagon rolled into town carrying Margaret Flynn, Mara Brennan, Ethan Cole, and Ruth Brennan. Behind them, at a discreet distance, rode Tom Henderson and a dozen other ranchers who'd decided that some things were worth standing up for, even if it meant trouble. The wagon stopped in the center of the square. Flynn stepped down first, her presence immediately drawing attention. Then Mara, dressed in a simple but clean dress Ruth had made for her, looking younger than her 13 years, but standing with a straightness in her spine that spoke of hard-won courage. People stopped what they were doing, conversations trailing off as recognition spread through the crowd. That's her, the whispers ran. That's Brennan's runaway bride. What's she doing here? Where's Brennan? Flynn raised her hand and her voice carried across the suddenly silent square. My name is Margaret Flynn, attorney at law. I'm here today with Mara Brennan, who has something to say to all of you. I ask that you listen with open minds and hearts to a child who's been denied her voice for too long. She stepped aside, leaving Mara alone on the wagon bed, visible to everyone, vulnerable and exposed and brave beyond measure. The girl who'd once whispered, "I'm too young to be a wife," in the darkness, was about to shout it in the daylight, and whatever came next would determine not just her fate, but whether justice could still mean something in a town built on one man's money. Mara took a breath, looked out at the gathered crowd, and began to speak. Her voice shook at first, barely carrying beyond the first row of onlookers, but Mara pushed through the fear the way she'd practiced 100 times in Ethan's kitchen. My name is Mara Brennan. I'm 13 years old, and 6 weeks ago my father sold me to Marcus Brennan for $500 to settle a gambling debt. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, and Mara watched the ripples spread across faces in the crowd. Shock, discomfort, recognition. Some people looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. Others leaned forward, drawn by the rawness of her testimony. He called it a marriage contract, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He told me I should be grateful, that I was lucky a man like Mr. Brennan wanted me. But I'm not lucky. I'm terrified, because I know what happened to his other wives. 3 women, all young, all dead, within 5 years of marrying him. And now he wants me to be number 4. A murmur ran through the crowd, uncomfortable and uncertain. Ethan stood beside the wagon, his hand resting on his pistol, scanning faces for signs of trouble. He spotted several of Brennan's men in the crowd, watching with hard eyes but making no move yet. Waiting for orders, probably, or for Brennan himself to arrive. I tried to tell my father I was too young, Mara said. I begged him not to do this, but he didn't care. The money was all that mattered to him, so I ran. My aunt helped me escape, and Mr. Cole, she gestured to Ethan, he gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. He didn't know me. He didn't owe me anything, but he listened when I said I was too young to be a wife. He believed me when no one else would. Margaret Flynn stood off to the side, taking notes with quick, precise movements, documenting everything for the legal record. Ruth watched from the wagon seat, her face tight with worry, but her eyes fierce with pride. "Now, Mr. Brennan wants me back," Mara continued. "He says I'm his property because he paid for me. He's burned Mr. Cole's pasture, threatened anyone who helps me, and paid judges to rule in his favor. But I'm not property. I'm a person. And I'm here today to tell everyone in Silver Creek that I will never consent to marry Marcus Brennan. Not today, not ever. Because I'm too young to be anyone's wife, and even if I wasn't, I deserve better than a man who buys children and buries wives." The crowd's murmur grew louder, conversations breaking out in pockets. Some faces showed sympathy, others anger, though whether that anger was directed at Mara or Brennan wasn't yet clear. Then a woman stepped forward from the crowd, middle-aged and worn by hard work, her voice cutting through the noise. "I knew Marcus Brennan's second wife," she called out. Anna, her name was. She was 16 when they married, sweet girl, always kind to everyone. She died 2 years later. They said she fell down the stairs, but I helped prepare her body for burial. She had bruises that didn't match a fall. Old bruises and new ones. The woman's testimony hung in the air like an accusation. Another voice joined hers, this one an older man with a shopkeeper's apron. His third wife, Catherine, she came into my store once with a black eye. Tried to hide it with powder, but I saw. When I asked if she was all right, she looked terrified, said she'd walked into a door. But the fear in her eyes wasn't fear of embarrassment. It was fear of what would happen if she told the truth. More voices now, people who'd seen things, known things, but kept silent because Brennan owned the town, and speaking against him meant losing your livelihood, your home, your safety. But Mara's courage had cracked something open, given permission for truth to spill out into the daylight. Then the crowd parted, and Marcus Brennan himself strode through, his face mottled with rage, Sheriff Cunningham trailing reluctantly behind him. Brennan's eyes fixed on Mara with such naked hatred that Ethan's hand tightened on his pistol. "This is slander," Brennan announced, his voice carrying across the square. "This child has been poisoned against me by troublemakers and agitators. She's a minor. She has no legal right to refuse the contract her father signed. Sheriff, arrest her for vagrancy and that man," he pointed at Ethan, "for kidnapping." Cunningham looked deeply uncomfortable, his gaze moving between Brennan, Mara, and the gathered crowd. "Mr. Brennan, maybe we should—" "I said arrest them." But before Cunningham could move, Margaret Flynn stepped forward, a sheaf of papers in her hand. "Sheriff, before you do anything precipitous, you should know that I have here an emergency injunction from the Territorial Court in Helena specifically prohibiting any arrest or detention of Mara Brennan pending the resolution of her case. Any attempt to violate this order will be considered contempt of court and federal overreach. Do you understand?" Cunningham took the papers, scanning them with increasing dismay. "This is signed by Judge Whitmore." "It is. Judge Whitmore has taken a personal interest in this case. He's quite concerned about reports of child trafficking disguised as marriage contracts. So unless you want to explain to a federal judge why you ignored his direct order, I suggest you stand down." Brennan's face went from red to purple. "This is outrageous. I have legal rights." "You have a contract that's currently under review by multiple courts," Flynn interrupted calmly. "You do not have legal custody of this child. You do not have the authority to compel her return, and you certainly don't have the right to threaten violence against those who've given her shelter. Now, I suggest you step back and let Mara finish her testimony. Unless you'd prefer to have this conversation continue in a courtroom in Helena, where your financial influence carries considerably less weight." The standoff crystallized, everyone watching to see which way it would break. Brennan's hired men had moved closer, hands near their weapons. Ethan had shifted position to put himself between them and Mara. Tom Henderson and his ranchers had materialized from the crowd, forming a loose line of support. The whole square balanced on the edge of violence. Then a new voice cut through the tension, strong and authoritative and utterly unexpected. "That's quite enough, Marcus." An older woman pushed through the crowd with the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to fear. She was perhaps 70, impeccably dressed despite the frontier setting, and she carried herself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ethan didn't know her, but the way Brennan's face went pale suggested he did. "Mrs. Caldwell," Brennan managed, "this doesn't concern you. It concerns me when my town's reputation is being destroyed by a man who thinks his money makes him above decency. She stopped in front of Mara, studying the girl with sharp eyes that missed nothing. You're the child in question? Yes, ma'am, Mara said quietly. And you're 13 years old? Yes, ma'am. Do you wish to marry Marcus Brennan? No, ma'am. I don't wish to marry anyone. I'm too young. Mrs. Caldwell nodded slowly, then turned to face Brennan with an expression that could have frozen fire. I am Henrietta Caldwell. I own the Caldwell Mining Company, the Caldwell Land Trust, and approximately 40% of the commercial buildings in Silver Creek. Which means, Marcus, that I own more of this town than you do, even if I've never felt the need to remind people of that fact until now. Brennan's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. I've known about your previous wives, Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. I've suspected, along with many others, that their deaths were neither accidental nor natural. But I said nothing because I had no proof, and because challenging you seemed like more trouble than it was worth. That was cowardice on my part, and I regret it deeply. But I will not be silent while you attempt to acquire a fourth victim. She turned to address the crowd. I'm calling an emergency town council meeting for tomorrow morning. The topic will be whether Silver Creek wishes to be known as a place that protects children or a place that sells them to the highest bidder. I know which side I'll be arguing for. I suggest the rest of you search your consciences and decide where you stand. The effect was immediate and profound. Mrs. Caldwell's wealth and influence were apparently considerable enough to rival Brennan's, and her public condemnation had given permission for others to voice their own doubts and disgust. The crowd's mood shifted palpably, murmurs of support for Mara growing louder, hostile looks directed at Brennan rather than at the girl on the wagon. Brennan saw it happening, saw his grip on the town's narrative slipping away, and desperation replaced rage in his expression. This is conspiracy, he insisted, his voice rising. You're all being manipulated by outside agitators who don't understand our ways, our laws. Our laws. Mrs. Caldwell interrupted icily. Should not permit the sale of children. If they do, then our laws need changing. And if you're the kind of man who hides behind unjust laws to justify predatory behavior, then you're not the kind of man this town should be defending. Mara watched all of this unfold with something like wonder on her face, as if she couldn't quite believe that speaking her truth had catalyzed such a response. Ethan caught her eye and nodded encouragement, pride swelling in his chest at her courage. Sheriff Cunningham, reading the crowd's mood and apparently deciding his career prospects were better served by siding with Caldwell than Brennan, cleared his throat. Mr. Brennan, I think it would be best if you left the square. Let tempers cool. Let the legal process work itself out. The legal process is mine, Brennan snarled. I own Judge Morrison. He cut himself off, but the damage was done. The admission hung in the air, confirmation of what everyone had suspected but few had dared say aloud. Even Cunningham looked shocked, or perhaps he was just good at pretending to be. Margaret Flynn's smile was sharp as a knife. Thank you for that candid admission, Mr. Brennan. I'll be sure to include it in my formal complaint to the Territorial Bar Association regarding judicial corruption. I'm quite certain Judge Morrison will be interested to hear that you've been publicly claiming ownership of his decisions. Brennan realized his mistake too late. His face cycled through emotions, rage, fear, calculation, before settling on cold fury. This isn't over, he said, looking at each of them in turn. You think you've won something here today, but you've only made things harder for yourselves. I have resources, connections, ways of making problems disappear that none of you can imagine. Is that a threat? Flynn asked pleasantly. Because making threats in front of witnesses, including a sheriff, tends to strengthen rather than weaken the opposition's legal position. Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and stalked away through the crowd, which parted to let him pass but closed behind him like water, offering no support or sympathy. His hired men followed, casting uncertain glances back at the scene they were leaving. When he was gone, the tension broke like a fever. People surged forward, wanting to speak to Mara, to offer support, to share their own stories of Brennan's abuses. Mrs. Caldwell organized it with brisk efficiency, establishing a proper testimony process, making sure Flynn documented everything that might be useful in court. An older woman approached Mara with tears streaming down her face. I was friends with Anna, Brennan's second wife. She told me once that she was afraid, that he hurt her when he was angry. I should have done something, should have helped her. I've carried that guilt for 10 years, but you're so young, and you're so brave. You did what Anna couldn't. You saved yourself. Mara took the woman's hands, her own eyes wet. It's not your fault. He's powerful, and people who are powerful make it hard to stand against them. But maybe together we can make sure no one else has to be as scared as Anna was. The testimony continued for over an hour, a flood of suppressed truth finally finding voice. By the time it was done, Flynn had enough material to bury Brennan in legal proceedings for years, and more importantly, the court of public opinion had decisively turned against him. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Mrs. Caldwell approached Ethan. "Mr. Cole, I owe you an apology. I heard about the fire on your property and did nothing. I suspected Brennan's involvement, but chose not to interfere. That was wrong of me." "You're interfering now," Ethan replied. "That's what matters. Still, I'd like to make amends. Your pasture needs reseeding, your fences repair. I'll cover the costs and I won't hear any argument about it. Consider it my penance for cowardice." "That's generous, ma'am, but it's not generosity. It's debt payment. You stood up when I stayed silent. The least I can do is ensure you don't lose everything for doing the right thing." She turned to Mara. "As for you, young lady, you'll need a place to stay during the legal proceedings. Somewhere Brennan can't reach, but somewhere more comfortable than a cellar. My house has plenty of room, and I assure you no one threatens my guests without answering to me personally." Mara looked to Ethan, uncertain. He nodded encouragement. "Mrs. Caldwell's right. You'll be safer with her, more comfortable, and it's not hiding anymore. You've spoken your truth. Now we let the law catch up to what justice demands." "But what about you?" Mara asked. "Brennan might still come after you, try to burn the rest of your ranch. Let him try. He's lost the town's sympathy, which means he's lost his cover for violence. Any move he makes now will be seen for what it is: retaliation against someone who helped a child. He's smart enough to know that would destroy him completely." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. Margaret Flynn worked tirelessly, filing motions, gathering depositions, building a case so comprehensive that even a corrupt judge would have trouble dismissing it. The territorial court in Helena reviewed all the evidence and issued a preliminary ruling. Mara's forced betrothal contract was void pending full investigation, and any attempt to enforce it would be treated as kidnapping under federal law. Judge Morrison, seeing which way the wind was blowing and apparently deciding his career was worth more than Brennan's money, recused himself from the case, citing conflict of interest. The new judge assigned was a woman, Patricia Thorne, known for her strict interpretation of law and her complete immunity to bribery. Brennan tried to fight it, throwing money at lawyers and calling in favors from every politician he'd ever bought, but the tide had turned against him. Newspapers across the territory picked up Mara's story, framing it as a test case for children's rights and the limits of parental authority. Reformers rallied around her cause. Even some legislators began talking about new laws to prevent similar situations. The final hearing took place on a cold morning in late autumn. The Helena courthouse was packed with observers, journalists, reformers, ordinary citizens who'd come to witness what they hoped would be justice finally served. Mara sat beside Margaret Flynn at the plaintiff's table, dressed simply but with quiet dignity, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Brennan sat across the aisle with his expensive lawyers, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. His eyes never left Mara, and the hatred in them was palpable enough to make Ethan's hand drift toward his pistol. But this was a courtroom, and violence here would be legal rather than physical. Judge Thorne reviewed the case with meticulous care, asking pointed questions of both sides. When Brennan's lawyers tried to argue property rights and parental authority, she cut them off with precision. "I've read the contract in question," she said, her voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "It describes the transfer of a 13-year-old child to a 52-year-old man in exchange for money. That is not marriage. That is human trafficking dressed in legal language. And while I'm aware that such arrangements have historically been tolerated in various jurisdictions, I am not bound by injustice simply because it has precedent." She turned her attention to Mara directly. "Miss Brennan, you've been very brave in speaking up about your situation. I want to hear from you now, in this court, whether you consent to the marriage your father arranged." Mara stood, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor Ethan could see running through her frame. "No, Your Honor. I do not consent. I never consented. I'm 13 years old. I should be learning and growing and figuring out who I want to be, not serving as property for a man who's already buried 3 wives. I'm too young to be anyone's wife, and I refuse to let money and contracts determine my future." Judge Thorne nodded slowly. "And what would you like to happen, Miss Brennan, assuming this court rules in your favor?" "I want to go to school," Mara said, and her voice carried a yearning that spoke to dreams long deferred. "I want to learn to read better, to understand mathematics and history. I want to become a teacher someday, help other children who don't have anyone to speak up for them. I want a future that belongs to me, not to my father's debts or Mr. Brennan's desires." Those seem like reasonable aspirations for a child your age. Thorne turned back to the assembled court. "I'm ruling as follows. The betrothal contract between Mara Brennan and Marcus Brennan is hereby declared void and unenforceable. Miss Brennan is to be removed from her father's custody due to his demonstrated willingness to sell her welfare for personal gain. Temporary guardianship is granted to Mrs. Henrietta Caldwell, who has petitioned this court for that responsibility and demonstrated both the means and the character to provide appropriate care." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Furthermore, I'm recommending to the territorial legislature that laws be passed prohibiting marriage contracts for anyone under the age of 16 without the explicit documented consent of the minor involved. What has happened to Miss Brennan should not be possible under our laws. Until those laws change, I will interpret existing statutes in ways that protect children rather than commodify them." The courtroom erupted in applause and angry shouting in equal measure. Brennan's lawyers immediately filed for appeal, but Judge Thorne shut them down with icy efficiency, noting that her ruling was based on federal anti-trafficking statutes that superseded territorial contract law. Brennan himself said nothing, just stared at Mara with an expression that promised the fight wasn't over, that he'd find other ways to hurt her and everyone who'd helped her. But his power had been broken here, in this courtroom, by a girl who'd found the courage to say no, and a system that, however imperfectly, had finally listened. Outside the courthouse, Mara was swarmed by well-wishers and reporters. Margaret Flynn managed the chaos with practiced ease, making statements about justice and children's rights, while keeping Mara protected from the overwhelming attention. Mrs. Caldwell stood nearby like a guardian dragon, and Ruth wept openly with relief and pride. Ethan hung back, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. He'd done what he'd set out to do, kept Mara safe long enough for justice to find its footing. The rest was up to her now, the future she'd fought so hard to claim. She found him eventually, breaking away from the crowd to throw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for not giving up." "You did the hard part," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "All I did was provide a safe place to hide. You're the one who stood up and spoke truth. That courage was all yours. But I couldn't have done it alone. None of us can. That's the lesson here, I think. Alone, we're vulnerable to people with power and money. Together, standing for what's right, we're stronger than any individual tyrant." The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace Ethan hadn't known since Sarah's death. His ranch recovered with Mrs. Caldwell's promised assistance and help from neighbors who decided that community meant more than staying neutral. The horses came back from the creek. The pasture would reseed in spring. Life found its rhythms again, but different than before, richer somehow, with purpose beyond mere survival. Mara lived with Mrs. Caldwell, attending school for the first time in her life, and devouring books with the hunger of someone making up for lost time. She visited Ethan's ranch regularly, helping with chores and sharing stories about what she was learning. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by something brighter. Hope, confidence, the beginning of joy. Ruth stayed in the area, finding work as a seamstress in Silver Creek and rebuilding her relationship with a niece who'd become more daughter than anything else. She'd defied her brother, broken with her family's ugliness, and found redemption in standing for a child's right to choose her own path. Margaret Flynn returned to Helena but maintained correspondence, using Mara's case as precedent to challenge similar situations across the territory. Within a year, the legislature had passed the laws Judge Thorne recommended, and Flynn was being called to testify before territorial committees about children's rights and the need for reform. Marcus Brennan, facing multiple investigations into his previous wives' deaths and his business practices, quietly left Silver Creek within 3 months of the trial. Rumor said he'd gone to California, seeking fresh territory where his reputation hadn't preceded him. Ethan hoped the women there would be wiser than those in Montana had been, but he knew that hoping wasn't enough. Predators like Brennan would always exist. The only defense was courage to stand against them. The seasons turned, winter giving way to spring, giving way to summer. Mara's 14th birthday passed, then her 15th. She grew taller, filled out, her face losing the last vestiges of childhood and beginning to show the woman she'd become. But more than physical changes, she developed a presence, a certainty about her place in the world that came from having fought for it and won. On a warm evening in late summer, nearly 3 years after that desperate wagon ride that had brought her to his ranch, Mara sat with Ethan on his porch, watching the sun set over the repaired and thriving land. "I've been accepted to the teaching college in Helena," she said quietly. "I leave in 2 weeks." Ethan felt pride and loss war in his chest. "That's wonderful, Mara. You've earned it. I'm going to specialize in education for disadvantaged children, girls especially, ones who don't have opportunities or whose families don't value their potential. I want to give them what you and Mrs. Caldwell and Miss Flynn gave me, a chance to be more than what other people decided they should be." "You'll be an excellent teacher." "I hope so." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I wanted to thank you again. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can say it enough. You saved my life, Ethan, not just from Brennan, but from believing I had no choice, no voice, no value beyond what men decided I was worth. You listened when I said I was too young to be a wife, and you believed me. That changed everything." "You changed everything," Ethan corrected gently. "I just provided a safe place for you to find your courage. Everything that happened after, the testimony, the trial, the new laws, that was you refusing to be silent. That was you fighting back. Don't give me credit for your own bravery." She smiled, the kind of smile that held both gratitude and growing wisdom. "Then I'll thank you for being the kind of man who creates safe places for courage to grow. The world needs more people like you. The world needs more people like you. People who refuse to accept injustice just because it's legal or traditional. People who speak truth even when it's terrifying." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah would have been proud of you. She believed in exactly the kind of courage you've shown. I think you two would have understood each other well." "I wish I could have met her." "In a way you did. That cellar that kept you safe, this ranch that stood between you and Brennan, Sarah built those things, or helped build them. Her belief that protecting people mattered more than following unjust laws, that's what made all this possible. You're living proof that she was right." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In 2 weeks, Mara would leave for college, beginning a life she'd fought to claim. In 5 years, 10, 20, she'd touched countless other lives, teaching and advocating and refusing to accept that any child should be treated as property. The ripples from one 13-year-old's courage to say, "I'm too young to be a wife," would spread farther than any of them could imagine, changing laws and lives, and the fundamental understanding of children's rights across the territory and beyond. But for now, on this quiet evening, it was enough to sit together and watch the day end peacefully. Two people who'd faced darkness and emerged into light, changed but not broken, stronger for having stood together when it mattered most. Ethan thought of Sarah, hoped she could see what her legacy had accomplished. A child saved, a predator stopped, a community reminded that conscience mattered more than convenience. It wasn't the life they'd planned together, but it honored the values she'd taught him. That was enough. That would always be enough. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mara stood to leave, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "I'll see you tomorrow? I want to help with the fence repairs before I go." "Tomorrow," Ethan agreed, "and every tomorrow after until you leave. We'll make sure you remember how to mend fences, even when you're teaching children their letters." She laughed, the sound bright and untroubled in the evening air. "I'll remember everything. How to mend fences, how to calm frightened horses. how to stand up when powerful men say you can't. You taught me well." She walked into the gathering darkness toward Mrs. Caldwell's wagon waiting on the road, her stride confident and free. Ethan watched until she was gone, then turned back to his ranch, his home, his life that had become unexpectedly meaningful through the simple act of listening when a child said she needed help. The frontier stretched out around him, vast and wild and full of both danger and possibility. But tonight, his small corner of it was peaceful, a place where justice had prevailed and courage had triumphed over power. It wouldn't always be that way. The world would continue to test and challenge, to produce new threats and new injustices that needed confronting. But for tonight, the 13-year-old who'd been too young to be a wife was safe, free, and full of dreams about the future she'd fought to claim. And the rancher who'd chosen to protect her had rediscovered that his life could still matter, still make a difference, still honor the memory of a woman who'd believed that standing up for what was right was always worth the cost. In the darkness, a coyote called, and Ethan smiled at the familiar sound. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to choose between comfort and courage. But he'd learned something in these past 3 years, something Mara had taught him as much as he'd taught her. When you stand for what's right, when you refuse to let power and money determine justice, you're never truly alone. The right cause draws others to it, builds community, creates something stronger than any individual could be. He went inside, banked the fire, and prepared for sleep. And for the first time in the 3 years since Sarah's death, he felt certain she'd approve of how he'd spent his time on Earth. He hadn't saved everyone. He hadn't changed the whole world. But he'd saved one girl, helped change one corner of one territory, and proved that sometimes truth spoken in daylight really was stronger than corruption hiding in shadows. It was enough. It would always be enough. And when Mara graduated from teaching college, when she opened her first school for disadvantaged children, when she stood before legislatures arguing for laws to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, he'd be there, proud and certain that the courage she'd shown at 13 had been just the beginning of a life that would touch thousands. The girl who'd whispered, "I'm too young to be a wife," in the darkness of a desperate night, had found her voice and used it to change the world. And the rancher who'd chosen to listen when no one else would had learned that redemption sometimes came not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of human decency performed when they mattered most. In the quiet Montana night, justice slept peacefully for once, and morning would come as it always did, bringing new chances to choose right over easy, conscience over convenience, and courage over fear. That was the legacy Sarah had left, the lesson Mara had learned, and the future Ethan would continue to fight for as long as breath remained in his body. The story that began with a desperate wagon ride and a child's plea for help had become something larger than any of them, a testament to the power of standing together, speaking truth, and refusing to accept that injustice was inevitable just because it was legal. And in that testament lay hope for everyone who'd ever felt powerless, every child who'd needed someone to believe them, every voice that had been silenced by those who mistook wealth for righteousness. The fight would continue, because it always did. But tonight, they'd won. And that victory, hard-earned and dearly bought, would light the way for all the battles yet to come.